Hello, everyone. Genesis 2:16 to 17, where God commands the man, saying, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." And I've gone really blurry on this screen. That's another thing that happens. Let's see if I've got it. Yeah, all my settings are fine. So if it's just the internet struggling, so be it. So be it. If I move around a lot, that might fix it. Um, There's something about that knowledge of good and evil, right? From childhood, we develop a conscience and we learn that there's a difference between right and wrong. But I would wager to say that it doesn't quite enter into our imaginations that the penalty for a wrong might include eternal conscious torment. I would submit that that comes from somewhere else, that that idea is a foreign and exotic concept that isn't found in the scripture. It's certainly not found in the Old Testament. And where we might think we find scripture to substantiate such a belief in the New Testament, I would argue that that comes from incomprehension as a result of pop culture contamination. And some of the pop culture stuff is ancient. Like, it's ancient and it's just a mimetic idea that's replicated through time all the way back from Mesopotamia to now, but I think it speaks to our deep fears. Like, you might remember in childhood having some kind of uh, fear about a dark room, or for me, we lived in a two-story house, and the bedrooms were upstairs, and there was an extension on the bottom floor where there was a kitchen and a toilet at the far end, and that always was associated with darkness because it was so far away from the heart of the house. And my nightmares would include going to this bathroom, and there's something, um, primordial about that fear, something that's distant and dark, and then, if in my imagination I was sucked into that darkness, trying to exit would be difficult. The ground would become thick like molasses, and I wouldn't be able to move myself out of that hell, and so there is this idea of perpetual suffering being something that we would want to escape. Because in our imagination, a very stifling and terrifying idea would be perpetual discomfort, continuous discomfort. So, what do we do about that? Well, I think we should address it. That's what I think we should do. So, that's what we're going to do in this video. So, I've got a slideshow and we're going to talk through the points. As I say, come and go as you please, guys. I'm going to throw into the chat. There's Joe. Hello. I'll throw an invitation for people to jump on soon. I'm just going to rattle through a couple of concepts first, and then we can go through it. Like, I've got materials, so we're going to look at in the first hour. I don't know if we're going to go for 5 hours, but let's see if we can make it to the five levels of hell. Dante had nine. I can only give you five. Right? I can only give you five. I can't take you all the way down to treason. We're going to stop at greed. So the way it's going to go is we're going to talk about the ancient beginnings, right? Ancient beginnings. Where did this all come from? We're going to look at Mesopotamia. We're going to look at the Shadowlands without moral judgment. We're going to look at Egypt. We're going to look at Zoroastrianism. We're going to look at the early afterlife ideas and how they developed. And number two, we're going to have a little gander at the Hebrew shadows, to the Greco Roman influence, Sheol, the Greek influence, Gehenna. We're going to look at the Hellenistic dualism and what it brings to the Holy Writ and our understanding. And number three, we're going to look at from Christ to Dante and how hell becomes a place. Okay? How something that was once used symbologically becomes something that's almost geographic in its conceptualization. Um, Hell is corrective, not eternal. There's an idea. How Augustine posits eternal conscious torment justified by divine offense. Augustine was a wild one. Augustine was a wild one. I know Dante and Milton, right? These people really furnished the idea of what hell's all about for us, I believe. And yes, Joe, we'll see. I don't know if we will make it to the 6th house, but we'll see. And then our 4, pop culture and philosophical hellscapes. We look at Enlightenment critiques, Hume, Kant, Voltaire. We look at some of the pop culture references like Hellraiser and how that contaminates our spiritual language and lexicon and imagination. We'll look at some TV shows, Lucifer, The Good Place, and then modern theology, the rise of annihilationism and universalism. And I think you'll find that those concepts, annihilationism and universalism, are actually tied in to very, very ancient, early Christian thought. And in the 5th hour, I might get through this in half an hour. I'll see. Hell around the world and final thoughts. So I thought it might be interesting to work out, is it only Christians that have this infernal dread? Is it only Christians that produce this? Or is it just Christians in Islam? Just the Christians and the Muslims? Or like what's going on in other religions, right? That's interesting. I want to find out what that is all about. Thank you, Joe. Yes, I'm going to need those blessings to make it through. So let's go to some key ideas, right? Here's some things you might be struggling with if you're here talking about hell today. God, I'm so blurry on. Is that just me? Can I fix that? Can I move something like if I do this? I just come really forward and then I'm clearer. Um, maybe I can do this. Hold on. Gadoosh. No, I didn't do anything. How about this? Gadoosh. That's slightly better. So let's talk about this idea here. Existential dread, right? You might have experienced existential dread if you are considering hell and all that might mean. The visceral anxiety of being, suffering, or being forgotten forever, often linked to eternal punishment or annihilation. Hell becomes the ultimate mirror of meaninglessness, right? So you've heard of the term existential dread, people discuss it. I used to have existential dread um, visited upon me as I was trying to wrestle with the character of God. Like, who is God as a person? Does God even like us? Or is God so sophisticated and so grandiose that God cannot actually meaningfully interact with us? So all our hurts and all our pains and all our anguish actually mean nothing to this stoic, just juggernaut of meaning. Like he's just striding through the cosmos of his own creation, and our voices just don't register, our heart doesn't register. But that is dread, right? It would surprise me, or rather, it would comfort me to learn that actually God's compassion exceeds my capacity to imagine. It's not less. God's ability to relate to me isn't going to be less than I would hope. It's going to exceed my hope in ways that I cannot intellectually give voice to. And so when I learned that, when I lean on that, it's like, right, okay, I can trust, I can have faith. I hope. No, I can't. I can't. I'm doing it right now. Metaphysical terror, a fear not just of pain, but of cosmic injustice. Right, that's the one. Hell here is not just frightening, it's wrong, and the soul feels violated by its very existence. This is one that the atheists will sometimes come out with. They certainly have this uh, this concept of hell being blasphemous, or just not even blasphemous. I think at first blasphemous, but against their own conscience, it's blasphemous against their own being. It's just a reviling idea to them. And I think there might be something to that critique. I think there might be something to be said about how we ought to be careful before we ascribe to God things that would be beneath us, especially when God describes himself as someone who is generous and compassionate towards his own enemies, right? Should love the enemy. Well, what do you make of that? Anxious torment or psycho-spiritual dissonance. Another one that atheists or just those who leave Christianity might feel when someone or maybe when someone believes they or loved ones are trapped eternally. This distress is not just sadness, it's a soul deep fracture. And many people carry this deep burden of being like, you know what, I'm such a devout Christian now, but my poor mother and father never had a confessional moment. My poor mother and father, they never prayed the Lord's Prayer. Therefore, they are doomed. They are in hell, being burnt alive and tortured by demons. But I'm going to be good. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to get through that because ultimately my relationships with God the Father and it really sucks that mom and dad, who are really nice to me, are in hell being tortured by demons. But I will move on. And that's the most important thing. It's like, I don't think that's the most important thing. I think you should move heaven and earth to save those relationships. And I think everybody understands that. I do. Am I so rare? I'm compassionate towards the evildoer that I want redemption and reconciliation. Am I some new thing? Do you not understand me? Because I want people to have hope and the capacity to improve themselves. Am I the alien? Well, let me come before God and tell God something, because you might learn a thing or two here about compassion and love. But, the temerity that I'm going to teach God about morality, isn't it more likely the case that my capacity for forgiveness does not exceed God's? Well, I guess a Calvinist might say, well, it's not that your compassion exceeds God's. It's more that your compassion is ill-advised and wrong-headed. You don't exceed God in your capacity for forgiveness. Your capacity for forgiveness is pathological. But I would say, no, it's not. Are you going to say that Daryl Davis, who went to the KKK, so Daryl Davis is a black jazz musician in America, and he went to Ku Klux Klan meetings, which is a white supremacist group, and he attended, he put himself at risk to meet with these racists. And when he did so, he learned that racist is not an immutable position. You can modify someone's beliefs and behavior through relationship. And that's exactly what Daryl Davis did. He modified those people's relationships with himself. Well, that's not what I meant to say. I mean that he met with people where they were and changed who they are. And that was the modification. It was through relationship. So are we going to say Daryl Davis is greater than God? No, because I didn't see, but Jesus Christ was on a cross. Jesus forgave those who crucified him. Wait, now, do we actually believe that Jesus Christ forgave them, or do we just think Jesus just said that? Jesus, Jesus just said that. I'll be honest with you, in my heart, for the longest time, Jesus just said it. Jesus did not forgive those people. Oh, hell no. Jesus did not forgive those people. Jesus coming back to whoop their candy asses all up and down Israel. If you smell, that's what Jesus is doing. But I submit to you that Jesus, the rock Christ, isn't coming back to whoop candy asses. No, no. He returned triumphantly to establish a new reconciled spiritual landscape where man can relate to God in a beautiful, profound oneness and completeness of new covenant. Both done, new covenant in. That's what I believe. Jesus forgave those who crucified him sincerely, sincerely. And that doesn't sit right with me because I live in a vengeance culture. I live in a culture that loves revenge. It loves revenge. Any kind of political conversation you have, once you sit in that political conversation long enough and the water simmers down, you're just left with the trace elements. You know what those trace elements are that are left in the discussion? Revenge. People just want to exact revenge on one another. It's like, nah, nah. How about reconciliation? How about we do that instead? So, I don't know. I'm gonna close this music player 'cause I reckon that's what's messing up with my signal. Well, it's nice to listen to music. It takes up bandwidth. Okay, so moving on. Theophobia or damnation anxiety. All right. I'm going to make myself small again. A rare but recognized form of religious OCD, scrupulosity, the fear of going to hell or committing unpardonable sin. I had this form of OCD, and I think most Christians experience it where they come to the place in the Bible where Jesus talks about blaspheming the Holy Spirit, and you and your all your wisdom think that blaspheming the Holy Spirit is saying a sweary word against the Holy Spirit, which it could never be. It can't be that. Okay. First of all, that's an incredibly petty God. And secondly, you don't know what the Holy Spirit is. You don't know what that is. So your little OCD behavior isn't that, right? And it's just it's more whenever you see the term blaspheme, it has nothing to do with foul language. Nothing to do with foul language. And everything to do with subverting the will of God and presenting that subversion, which is probably some manifestation of Satanism, as a product of God. So when Jesus Christ was conducting exorcisms and releasing people of demons, when people said, aha, he does that because he's the master of demons, then that's blasphemy. That's a blasphemous notion because what you're doing is you are attributing to God the work of Satan. You are attributing to God the work of Satan. However, the sin, the thing that's the impediment to you, what intoxifies you, what mars your soul in that is not the fact that you said some words. It's not that you offended God. It's not that God's clutching his pearls like, oh, I can't believe you said that about me. Because that's the idea we get. That's what I sincerely believed. That God's ego was so fragile that if I said to God, oh, look, you said you did that, but I'm saying you didn't, that God would go, whoa, hang on, I created this whole universe, but this baby, this child of man has completely besmirched me. You're going to hell forever. That's not what it is. The contamination, the impediment, the nasty thing, it's what that does to you. It's what that does to you. When I say that the work of the Holy Spirit is the work of the dark one, I am putting myself in darkness. It's got nothing to do with me offending God and everything to do with me basically slapping my own chops, right? Giving myself a cha, right? I've just lost it, right? I've lost my orientation. I am blind. I am deaf. I am dead in my sin. Why? Because I have misidentified north for south, light for darkness. That's what's going on. That's what's going on, if you ask me. Then we have infernal grief, which is a more poetic term, and that's just a phrase you can coin to describe the grief of losing hope, justice, or love. This is Dante's "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here made real." And it kind of speaks to that idea again of believing that you're living atop an infernal trap door, that you could just be going about your day. What was that Sam Raimi movie that came out several years ago, Drag Me to Hell? The idea that you could just be cursed in some way by a button or whatever it was in that film, and you're going to be dragged to hell just in the midst of doing some puttering around the house type chore. One minute you're boiling an egg, the next minute you're being tortured to death by demons. I don't know what this is doing for content, but what I'm saying is these are ridiculous ideas. I want us to contend with the ridiculousness of these ideas. Okay, I don't want us to shy away and think, "Oh no, how spooky." I want us to push through the fear because ultimately, what we're going to get on is the idea that there's significance to suffering. Someone made the comment on the video I posted earlier that to simply be subjected to suffering alone with zero consequence of that suffering, it's just a perpetual suffering, is insanity. It's mindlessness. It doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense for God to create those circumstances because God is a meaningful being. And the things that God does, they have to contain meaning. And so for an entity to be subjected to eternal conscious torment, it doesn't produce anything. It's a spiritual dead end. And I don't believe that God would create spiritual dead ends in that way and sustain them in their dead endedness. And the reason for that is because God sustains all things. God is the substrate out of which he creates. That it isn't as if God was in the beginning with an equally powerful set of tools and raw materials, because that creates multiple gods. Occam's razor posits the existence of a single entity, whatever that might be. The singleness of God might confound us, but the tool shed isn't omnipotent, omnipowerful, etc. I'm pretty sure that's the same word. I just said one in English, but you know what I mean? It's just God who creates out of himself. And if that's the case, he's not going to put those constituent parts of himself in an eternal damnable state because really he's tormenting himself in that process. And that's to make God a sadist. You might think that perhaps there's another way to imagine that and to say, well, it doesn't necessarily make God a sadist, does it? Because God might be so, his ways might be so different, so mysterious that when God does it, it's not sadism. Nah, that doesn't hold water with me. So, yeah, ontological dread, the fear of being, the fear of being itself when it's corrupted or cut off from God. Hell isn't just punishment, it's a state of being wrongly existing. Wrongly existing. The fear of being itself when it's corrupted or cut off from God. Yeah, that's an understandable position, but that is the position of um, humanity. That is the position of humanity under the old covenant, and it's a sort of sleepiness. It's the amnesia experienced by most people today. They exist through distraction. They exist and perpetuate them or sustain, they maintain buoyancy of life through distraction. Because if they properly orientated themselves, they would recognize that they are perhaps not living as aligned as they could with the author of all meaning. And if you unhinge yourself from the structure of meaning, then you lose your bearings in a way that I think makes you feel spiritually adrift, which makes you open to all kinds of uh, wrongful motivations and ill conceived ideas. If you can hinge yourself to meaning, then I think it's like a strong root out of which many branches can form, and they can form into relationships, into work, into businesses, into organizations that help the cohesion of society. But if you remove the root of meaning, if you unhinge yourself from the fixture of purpose, then your purposes will become rudimentary, primordial, perhaps functional, but not ultimately sustainable in a way that replicates the institutions and networks that hold society together. And so, with the decrease of Christianity, you have the increase of chaos and chaotic elements. Um, Certainly see that in society in the United Kingdom. And I need to practice how I speak on those things because in the United Kingdom, you can be arrested for vociferously um, identifying the wrongs of society. So you need to be very careful with how you say it, or the British state will have you arrested. I'm not exaggerating. So, yeah, ancient beginnings, death before damnation. What are we going to say about that? Well, why is my camera so blurry to me? I hate how blurry it is. Let's see if I can get back in here and fix this. Is that a little bit better? Maybe. What about this? Is that a little bit better? Yeah, it's a little bit better. Okay, so let's just jump in it. Let's just pull up the notes and fire straight in as we get into the first hour of topics. Let me just get through this first. This first hour is going to go in very quickly. So before hell was fire and torment, before demons had names and pitchforks, the ancients stared into the same black veil of death, but what they saw was very different. So we go back to a time before all the pop culture references, all the movies and all the books, and indeed before Christianity, before Judaism, before any of that. What was humanity thinking? Was it like our dreams? Maybe we reflected on our dreams as children. Well, in Mesopotamia, they had something called the Ir-Kala. Okay, what is this Ir-Kala? Well, the core concepts involved there is that there's no heaven or hell as reward or punishment. Interesting. Afterlife was a grey shadowland ruled by Eresh Kigal. A grey shadowland? Now, that certainly permeated the popular culture. If you saw my video on hell today, you would have seen that picture of Sheol, and you saw how grey it looked. It was a grey shadowland. That's what Sheol looked like. So there's something again going into something that's deep inside mankind. This idea of darkness and shadow, of ill-defined lines, of the lack of ability to perceive color and thus denote what's going on in the environment. That's a precarious situation to be in for man because we rely a lot on the sense of vision to be aware of where potential predators might be coming from. So if you desaturate that sense, you increase the anxiety and the cortisol and the epinephrine in the system, right? The sympathetic nervous system fires up. So, yeah, that's what a grey shadowland does in my imagination. And this Erish Kigal is the queen of the underworld in ancient Mesopotamia, okay? And everyone went there. Everyone went there. Didn't matter what your moral conduct was. That's where you went. That's interesting, right? So this land is a place from which no one returns. The dead were ghosts, Gidim, and they ate dust and drank muddy water. And Gilgamesh laments this dreary fate in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that's very interesting for the Mesopotamians because obviously they have life and they see that the natural world is full of relative luster compared to what sounds like to me a bad dream. Just like my bad dream when I was a child. And that toilet extension was dark and dreary. So too was this Mesopotamian idea of this shadowland. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Tablet 12, we read, I will go down to the house of dust, and I will dwell with the dead. where they sit in darkness, clothed in feathers, and eat clay. Interesting. So this wasn't a hell for the wicked. It was a bleak democracy of the dead. No fire, no judgment, just the end. And so I imagine that there would have been competing beliefs in ancient Mesopotamia. I would imagine that there was people who would submit more colorful and perhaps more hopeful realities, that perhaps that Shadowland might have some kind of other potential. But the idea of it is this bleak place of a terminus, the end of history, just being a muddy, dark creation. This is something that resonates deeply with humans, especially when you make them contrast the difference between life and death. You know, we put our dead ones into the ground or we burn them to ash, and we look upon that and we might think to ourselves, well, that's the opposite of life. You know, I've got colors, I've got flowers, I've got scents, I've got cooking. What do they have? Well, they're in the ground, they're in the dirt. There's nothing, there's just mud. It's a shadowland, there's no light under the ground. You can't detect light if you're ash. So you can see that the ancient Mesopotamians didn't have a truly developed spirituality. They didn't integrate the deep spirit. I mean, they might have. I don't want to speak too boldly about the Mesopotamians as if I'm the leading foremost expert on Mesopotamia. I'm not. I'm just saying that with this belief here, it's truly been desaturated. They've taken away the color and the vibrancy of life, and they've contrasted that with shadow. We can see what happened. So then we go to ancient Egypt, right? And we've got this idea of the duat, the duat. The core concepts with the duat is that the soul, ba, the soul, passed through duat, a dangerous realm to reach paradise, the field of reeds. Isn't that nice? The field of reeds. It reminds me of the Elysium fields. So judgment occurred via the weighing of the heart ceremony. And if you're familiar with the Marvel superhero Moon, is it Moon Knight? I think Moon Knight is an ancient Egyptian infused superhero. He's got some kind of sacred power from ancient Egypt. And he goes through a similar ceremony where his heart's weighed. And if your heart was heavier than the feather of Mahat, which is the feather of truth, it was devoured by Amit, and you were annihilated, not tortured eternally. So, how interesting then, from Mesopotamia into Egypt, right? This is before Judaism, this is before any of these religions that we have today, that you had this idea then of the waiting, right? I shared the scripture of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Well, here's an idea here of good and evil, the weighing of the heart against this feather of truth. And if it's an appropriate weight, then you pass to the next stage, the fields of reeds. And if it's not, you are annihilated. This is quite similar to what a lot of us actually believe. It's different in how it's vocalized. The mythos of it is slightly different, but the ideas are the same. Right? There's something similar. So yeah, there's something about that. So the Book of the Dead, the Necronomicon, Ex Mortis. No, I don't think it's that. But the Egyptian Book of the Dead, spell 30b. Why do they call it spells? My heart, do not stand against me as witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. May I pass in peace. There we go. What an insightful word that was. So the key figure in all this is Osiris, god of the dead. He wasn't a torturer, but a restorer of life if one passed judgment. So in Egypt, death was a test, not a torture chamber. The worst fate wasn't burning in fire, it was non-existence. And I think a lot of us bring that idea of a test to the afterlife, don't we? We do. There's something about the human condition, about the structure of society, whereby we believe our value is best measured by a test. So whether that's weighing our heart against a feather of truth, or whether it's some kind of written test, or something that challenges us physically, doesn't need to be intellectually, but something that is a trial. It is through this trial, through this test, that we believe we will find value. But I actually believe that that's not quite right. There is something of that in Christianity. There is. And I think that there is something to be said for producing behaviors that demonstrate the conviction of the heart. But I think the rubric of seeing it as a test could be a little bit too quantitative in what I believe is a qualitative evaluation. There is a test of some degree. If you want to play around with the semantics, there is a test, there is a judgment, there is some kind of criteria, contrast going on. But I think ultimately you're not being weighed based on the sum of your goodness. It's more about where you end up. If I've been a warrior for an enemy force and I've killed and I've spread ideologies that are toxic to the well being of humanity, but then I spend the last 20 years of my life as a peacemaker speaking against those ideologies, I don't think that my past necessarily damns me or demonstrates a value that's less. I think it just speaks to the complex nature of what it is to be human. Um, just going to finish off a couple more reflections and we'll get right into the meat and potatoes. So, Zoroastrianism, you might have heard of Zoroastrianism. It's another ancient civilization. They have the Chinvat Bridge. Okay, the core concepts here are it's possibly the earliest dualistic religion to present a moral afterlife. The Chinvat Bridge separates the righteous from the wicked. So this is again quite early on in human civilization, and we have this knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil, the wheat and the tares, the separation, the division. And so the good pass over safely, and the evil fall into a fiery pit, but not necessarily eternal torment. So that's interesting. A bridge which the good can pass over safely, but the evil fall into a fiery pit. The invocation of fire, that which causes pain and perhaps purifies, right? And you also have this idea of the Angra Manu, which is an evil force akin to Satan. So in the Vendiadad, in the holy texts of Zoroastrianism, the souls of the wicked fall into the house of lies, into endless darkness, foul food, stench, and cries of woe. Doesn't that sound like something Jesus Christ would say? The souls of the wicked fall into the house of lies. You are of your father, the father of lies, into endless darkness, into outer darkness. Foul food, right? The idea of food that's foul. I have food to eat you know not of stench, this pestilence perhaps, and cries of woe, right? Woe to you, right? The wailing and gnashing of teeth. So there's something there. We can see that there's something there. There's something there. So Zoroastrianism drew one of the first lines between eternal reward and eternal punishment. And this moral polarity bled directly into later Judaism and in Christianity and Islam. So Mesopotamian society, punishment? No. Eternal? Yes, death was final. Was it based on morality? No. Was there fire? No. So the Mesopotamian afterlife was a very strange and bleak one, right? It's not based on punishment. It is an eternal state, but it's not based on morality, and there's no fire. The Egyptian afterlife, yeah, it had punishment, it had annihilation. Um, so was it eternal? No. Was it based on morality? Yes. And was there fire? No. And then you've got Zoroastrianism. Was there punishment? Yeah. Was it eternal? Possibly. Was it based on morality? Yeah. And was there fire? Yes. So that's an interesting one, right? So did any of those sound compelling to you? I can certainly see, I just find them interesting just from an anthropological perspective. I find them very interesting. Um, is it surprising that burning in hell isn't there in these early religions? Um, we can see something of it in Zoroastrianism, but I don't know if I'm surprised by it. Um, and so, could it be that our modern conception of hell is some kind of cultural Frankenstein? Well, certainly. But I think it's not, it's more than just a cultural Frankenstein. You know, culture is an expression of just the human psyche working itself out in stories. I think it goes back years and years. Um, so the earliest views of the afterlife were neutral or annihilative. Um, Eternal torture wasn't a part of early eschatology. Zoroastrianism, maybe the hinge point where morality enters the picture, and fire and punishment came later, not from God, but from culture. So, yeah, there's something to be said there, guys. Let's jump into the convo and see what's going on. We got there. What about the Scorpion King? Hakuma Sente. I remember that. I was big into that back in the day, in the early 2000s. Jackie says, what does it mean he is the God of the living? Yeah, he's the God of the living. So there's a distinction there, isn't there, Jackie? He is the God of the living. As if to say that with those who are dead, I don't think it's to say that God isn't the God of all. So there's something that God isn't the God over. It depends on the perspective of the relationship. Top down, God is master of all. Bottom up, there are those who are dead. And their relationship with God, nah. These are the ones that perhaps Christ would say, you are of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning, the liar. Perhaps, you know, these people who are dead don't have the appropriate relationship with God. And that's what Christ was talking about. Is where my head goes with that. Mailbox says it's cool to see that they knew that evil and good came from the heart. Yeah, that is cool, isn't it? There's something intuitive going on. The devil you don't says new, lol. It's a metaphor. Either way, new, lol. Dogmatic, revisionist, Abrahamic, silly billies. Oh man, somebody's getting silly billied up in the chat. You're welcome to silly Billy as much as you want. Joe says covenantal living, I think, Jackie. Yeah, Joe, that's a good way to summarize that. Covenantal. Christianity and Judaism get theirs from Plato. I respect the lore, the history, the ideals, and the observers in general. But these modern kids online calling themselves, oh, you're going somewhere with that. The devil, keep playing, keep playing. Jackie says, and by keep playing, I mean keep offering what you're saying. I'm not, that sounds like a threat. Yeah, keep playing, see what happens. Keep playing. Sometimes I mix up my vernacular too much. I watch too many films. Jackie says, if he is the God of the living, then is there an Egyptian God of the dead? I think it supersedes any one particular culture. It's not to say that they have an Egyptian God of the dead who can step in. You could do that if you wanted to, as part of your own, uh, you know, story, right? We can bring our own flavor to our own spiritual own spirituality. But if in terms of pure, like, what's the most triple distilled truth, then no, I wouldn't switch in an Egyptian god per se. I would just say that it doesn't it doesn't almost I don't want to say it doesn't matter. I would just say it's more of a ubiquitous umbrella anti-God. Because I think if God is love, if God is life, if God is light, if God is goodness, then these people who don't have God are naturally struggling without those nutrients, right? And so whatever God they have, this anti-God they have, is just something you might call a dark one, the dark one, the accuser, the obstacle, right? That's what they're in relationship with is an obstacle. Quite like that, right? An obstacle. Hasatan perhaps might work in there. Um, Hollywood's hell is pretty funny. It really is. It's just it's pulled right out of the imagination. Used to know what the god of the dead was known as Nimrod or Rekion. Yeah, those names sound familiar. Those names do sound familiar. So, a skedunkles, we're going into the Hebrew shadows to Greco-Roman flames now, right? Let's jump. Let's dive right in. Let's dive right in, mate. Um, so the kind of jumping off point for this one is that in the Hebrew Bible, there is no fire. You're going to say there is. There's the burning bush. There's this. There's that. There's the fire that Elijah calls down from heaven. Don't fight me. I don't get. I'm going to make. I'm going to make a declarative. I'm going to make just dug in statements, and you are not allowed to question them. In the Hebrew Bible, there is no fire, none. If your eyes are lying to you, if you see fire, there's no Satan poking you with a pitchfork. There's only shadows, silence, and dust. So, how did that become eternal torment? To trace that path, we need to pass through valleys, caves, get your torches out, and Greek philosophy itself. Is it easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for us to go through Greek philosophy itself? Probably, probably. I'm going to torture this. No, it's going to be good. Let's talk about Sheol, guys. We need to go into Sheol together. Let's go. Let's dive right in. So it literally means the grave, the pit, or the place of the dead. That's what Sheol gets you, right? We're in Sheol with this one. So it's not a moral destination. Not a moral destination. Both the righteous and the wicked go to Sheol. And there's many examples throughout the Hebrew Bible, in Psalms, Job, Isaiah. In Psalm 6:5, we read, "For in death there is no remembrance of thee. In Sheol, who shall give thee thanks?" In Psalm 89:48, we read, "What man is he that liveth and shall not see death? Shall he deliver his soul from the hand of Sheol?" Oh, that almost rhymes in English. That's a nice little coincidence. Shall he deliver his soul from the hand of Sheol? Somebody put that in a country song. Sonic Grace in the chat. Get that in a song, Sonic. So Sheol was a place of silence and forgetting, not punishment. It was death's waiting room, not a dungeon. Again, it's all building itself up to something here, isn't it? In ancient civilizations, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Zoroastrians, we can see that there's that bleakness, and then with the Egyptians and the Zoroastrians, there's a little something else going on. Maybe there's more than just the bleakness of death. And then here in Judaism, we're back to that place of bleakness, right? There's a slight bleak, there's not much motion, not much progress. It just seems like once you die, you're in this place, this shadow world again. It's almost like a callback to Mesopotamia. But then we see there's this Hellenistic influence, right? So then we get to Hades, right? So post exilic Judaism meets Greek thought. So as Jews interacted with Greeks post Alexander the Great, the 4th century BC, Hades began to overlap with Sheol, the tectonic plates of imagining what's going on in the spiritual world. And people look for purity. Don't do that with spirituality. Don't do it. Don't be like, well, it's only what the Jews know. It's whatever the Jews thought, because those are the pure ones. No, they're not. No, they're not. They are struggling just like everyone else. They might be the covenant people, but they are not the in fact, the whole story of Israel is that they are not very good at producing the results that would be conducive to their societies thriving. They don't have that kind of agility and and capacity, and that's not an indictment on the Israelites. This is more like a case study in humanity. Here's a random tribe in the Middle East. Let's see how they do in covenant with God. Oh, well, you know what I mean? Not so great. Does that mean everyone else would have been awesome? No, it doesn't mean that. So when these tectonic plates of imagination come together um, to try and bring about a better understanding, to try and enrich the imaginative architecture of what the afterlife might look like, let's not get too haughty. Let's not look for too much purity because we don't know what we're talking about. Instead, let's just hover above the fault lines and get a little look at the Himalayas of coolness around that. That was a great metaphor. You're referencing the Himalayas and stuff, and then I couldn't stick the landing. I just had to go with Himalayas of coolness. Whatever, right? Whatever. Give me another 10 years and then I'll be so eloquent. I'll be so eloquent. All right. What was I saying? Guys, we're talking about the Septuagint at this point. Skadunk. We're in there with the Septuagint. So that's where we see this Sheol becoming Hades, right? A lot of people saw the Greek as the sort of elite language, and the Hebrews wanted to, according to some people's analysis, sort of position themselves as this refined and sophisticated religion that is due some kind of import and due some kind of um, you know support and looked upon with reverence, and in order to entrench itself in a sort of reverential uh, theological place, the priesthood thought, let's write this bad boy in Greek. Right? We're going to walk around reading stuff in Hebrew like a bunch of assholes. It's like, no, we're not going to do that. Let's get this bad boy in Greek so that all these Greek people that we're surrounded with can read what we've got and think to themselves, you know what, these guys have got something here. I appreciate the time and effort they put into translating this. And so that you get the Septuagint, right? And it, you know, curries favor with the Greeks. It puts them into the pop culture. It's a bit easier, you know what I mean, when you write it in the kind of state language, the language of the day. And what happens when you do that is you end up borrowing terms. And sometimes those terms work. Sometimes it's a happy coincidence that, okay, we go from Sheol to Hades. Do I think that's ultimately very illuminating? No, no, I don't. But at the same time, it's just an interesting thing that happened. And let's move on. So, Hades in Greek myth is an underworld deity. If you're familiar with the legendary journeys of Hercules, perhaps the live action show that was filmed in New Zealand with Kevin Sorbo, produced by Rob Tappert, directed many an episode by Sam Raimi. It had Lucy Lawless featured in a few episodes, who also starred in her own show, Xena Warrior Princess, who married Rob Tappert, with cameos from Bruce Campbell, who played Autolycus, the King of Thieves. You might remember Salmonius. He was a happy-go-lucky character. And then Aeolus, the good friend of Hercules. Big fan of the show. Big fan of the show. But Hades was a underworld deity, okay? And his domain was this afterlife. Okay. It was more vivid, it was a more mapped out place than Sheol. So in Greek myth, we have a couple more elements to bring in, right? In Greek myth, it's not just Hades, we've got Elysium. Oh, what's Elysium? Well, that includes rewards. And then you've got Tartarus, right? And Tartarus is about punishment. So the dead were judged and sorted. We've got a quote here from Luke 16:23, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And in Hades, he lift up his eyes, being in torments. And we will remember that verse from, just kind of fixing that there, from Luke, where it references Hades. And we might think that, oh, well, if Luke is making reference to Hades, right, if he's describing something that Christ said, then certainly we can just come out confidently and say Hades exists. But the issue there is we don't know what we're talking about. We have no idea what we're talking about. Hades is just a noise that we make. And within that noise, there's an attachment to Greek thought about the afterlife. Now, just because Jesus references the place, it doesn't mean that he's mapping out a geopolitical, translucent, invisible state of existence called Hades, where there's good and bad and whatnot. It doesn't mean that that's real. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not real. He could be talking about something that's kind of real. But again, I would warn us against thinking, well, this is the purity test. This is the purity test passed. Hades has passed the purity test because Christ made reference to it in a story. And it's like, well, hold on. What was the point of the story? Was the point of the stories to legitimize the belief in Hades? Or was there something else that Christ was trying to communicate in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? Well, certainly it's the latter. We know, I never use that right. Is the latter? Is that is the one that comes later? The latter. Certainly, we know that the parable is about this sort of rich leader who didn't have the spiritual qualities necessary, or even the cultural sort of righteousness embedded in his family to sort of see him translated into a better afterlife, compared to the more humble and the more sort of low down Lazarus, who was rather subversively lauded and exalted, despite the fact that on earth it was the rich man who was exalted. And how interesting, people point out that the rich man doesn't have a name, and yet Lazarus does have a name, because indeed Lazarus is first where the rich man is last. And that sort of speaks to the whole ethic that Christ brings, that whole subversive, all right. So there's something about being humble and good natured. You don't have to be a rat bastard to get by. You can actually be good, and God's going to reward that. All right. So by the time of Jesus, Jewish views had splintered. Some still saw Sheol, but others imagined torment in paradise. So the Greek underworld had begun to contaminate the Hebrew pit, right? So Sheol was developing into something. And so there seems to be this sort of fluctuating, imprecise, and I think imprecision is something that we need to be quite comfortable with as we discuss afterlife. We're talking about hell today, but afterlife in general, imprecision is something that we have to get comfortable with. And there's nothing wrong with imprecision. And there's nothing that I can find that suggests that we are better people for having firm, dug in, beliefs on the afterlife. There's nothing I can see that says, because Christ said Hades in Luke 17, it's all about Hades. Hail Hades. It's like, nah, I don't think that's what we're supposed to take away from that. And yet, if you wanted to use Hades, you could. I don't. There's no point getting contentious about it. So, something we often see in the New Testament is references to hell from Christ, which actually come from the term uh, Valley of Hinnom. And it's quite an interesting way how we get there. So, Ge in the Hebrew is valley. So you got Ge, and then you've got Henna, which in the Hebrew would be Hinnom, Ge Hinnom, Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna. We just say it slightly differently. So Gehenna is literally Valley of Hinnom. And doesn't that strike you as odd? Why did we do that? And isn't it interesting how the mediators of faith, the Catholic Church, for lots of Europe's history, would mediate these stories in such a way that they don't reach you with the purity and richness with which they were first uttered and recorded? Instead, the Catholic Church, and I don't mean to, it's easy for me to just point at Catholics as if to say I'm not contaminated by the same biases as those Catholics. I shouldn't do that. We're all subject to vice. We're all capable of error. But see those Catholics, see the way they just morph those scriptures and turn them into lies and then sold those lies. Surely they will burn for this. I'm only joking. I'm only joking. I'm only joking. We're all good, guys. We're all good. A lot of respect for the Catholic Church. They're doing numbers. They're actually doing okay in the UK just now. Actually, they're kind of sustaining a wee bit better. They're sustaining. The Protestants just don't have a clue in this country. But that's a political comment. I'll leave that for another stream. But it's interesting, isn't it? The richness that comes when you actually get the true meaning of the language. Isn't it a shame that we edited the text in such a way? So this valley of Hinnom was a valley outside of Jerusalem that was used for child sacrifice. We read about that in 2 Kings 23:10 and in Jeremiah 7:31. And of course, this valley would become a symbol of divine judgment and disgrace because it was a terrible thing. The Valley of Hinnom, it was like talking about, well, it's difficult to find something that's a direct comparison. It would be a place where something terrible happened. But I couldn't say ground zero, in New York City, ground zero, because the New York people turned ground zero into something else. It's not seen as a place of disgrace and shame. Instead, ground zero is seen as a monument of human overcoming and resilience. So maybe something else like Death Valley in California, the Valley of Hinnom, the Valley Death Valley, because nothing grows in Death Valley, and it's a impediment to life if you go. But it's still not got the same connotations of disgrace. Maybe there's a nuclear testing site in America that you guys know about. There, somewhere in New Mexico, the Hills of Eyes, wherever the Hills of Eyes is, that's the place. That's the Valley of Hinnom, right? Just a disgraceful, mutant, just infested hellhole. You don't want to go there. I don't think Scotland or the UK has anything quite like that either. Just a place of disgrace. Maybe the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, because Jimmy Savile and all those monsters that the BBC was hiding. Jimmy Savile bought a property somewhere in the Highlands of Scotland. Maybe that's our Valley of Hinnom. But yeah, Jesus uses this term 11 times in Mark 5:22 and Mark 9:43. Scholars debate literal hellfire or prophetic metaphor for Jerusalem's fall. And certainly looking at this through a covenantal lens, the metaphor for Jerusalem's fall seems to make more sense because we just don't have the the attention meted out in the direction of afterlife explanation. We don't have the granular details on that. So it would be strange and jarring if Christ was, and I do believe that Christ does allude to spiritual realities, but if Christ was going to carefully met out what precisely the afterlife looked like, I would imagine that that would look different than to pepper that language into covenantal judgment utterances. So I'm going to talk about the condemnation of the state of Israel in relationship with God. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to go into a treatise on what the afterlife looks like. No, I don't think that's what was happening. And so that's where the scholarly dispute would be. In Mark 9:43, we read, "And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than to go into Gehenna, into the fire that shall never be quenched." In Matthew 10:28, we read, "Fear him that is able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." So, what do you get from those two verses? "And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than to go into Gehenna, into the fire that shall never be quenched." Well, we know that Jesus Christ's um, analysis of life and death is quite different to the common person's. For Jesus, the dead bury the dead in one place. Well, what are you talking about? Those people are clearly alive. You're saying they're dead and they're burying the dead? What does that mean? And Jesus also says, anyone who believes in me has passed from death to life. All right, well, what are you talking about then? What is this idea then that if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed. So it seems to me that what Christ is saying there is that if you have some kind of uh, asset or some kind of connection, some kind of instrument with which you engage with your current life, and this offends thee, that thing contaminates your soul, then it's better to disconnect from whatever that is that's introducing the contamination, because there you will find entrance into life. You might consider yourself maimed because you have cut off a connection, cut off something that you used, something that you believed had utility, like a hand. But it's better for you to cut that hand off and to enter into life maimed. Better that than to go into the valley of Hinnom, where the fire is and will never be quenched. Well, what's the valley of Hinnom in this expression in Matthew 9:43? Could it be the terminus and destruction of the old covenant state of Israel? Could it be 70 AD? So it's better for you to listen to me and to uh, seemingly spoil something that you found advantageous, perhaps your position in Israeli society, because it's going to hell in a handbasket. And if you don't maim yourself, if you don't cut off that connection, and indeed perhaps suffer some kind of societal loss, but if you don't do that, you will find yourself in the fire, and that fire never goes out. Talking about the delineation between the old covenant and the new covenant, you will meet that second death terminus of the old covenant in AD 70 if you do not cut off that hand. And could it be that Matthew 10:28, fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna? The connection of soul and body being a reference to that covenantal relationship with God, and that this will be destroyed in the valley of Hinnom, right? And the hills have eyes, ground zero, Jimmy Savile house in the Highlands. You will find your destruction there if you don't orientate yourself properly. So some traditions claim that it became a burning garbage dump, but modern archaeology doesn't fully support this idea. It was already infamous before Jesus, symbolizing desecration and judgment. So we don't need to garnish it with the idea of it being a burning garbage dump. It was already spiritually representing some kind of horrid, nasty fate. Um, so Gehenna wasn't hell, never was hell. The Valley of Hinnom, that's what Gehenna, meaning valley, Henna meaning Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom wasn't hell. It's a preposterous idea. It was a metaphor loaded with national memory, with horror, and God's fury over injustice. Jesus may have been warning of earthly judgment more than eternal torment. So that's what's going on there. Um, so let's see what we get. Can you jump over to the chat for a second? Yeah. Azazel. Yeah, Azazel was quite the fallen angel. I still need to watch that film, Azazel. It's about the post-rapture world. I want to check that out. The thief on the cross was baptized with fire. He wasn't burned up. Hallelujah. I like Sheol as the place of the dead divided into sections. Yeah, it could have some utility as a mental sort of construct. Boss, sorry, bosom of Abraham and Sheol. Yeah. For a second there, Jack, I thought you were saying Boston is the Valley of Hinnom in America. Mailbox says, seems like there were some people sleeping and others awake in Sheol. Sheol in scriptures was interesting. Of course, Bruce Campbell rules, absolutely. Um, Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom, is on the side of the Temple Mount, which kept fires going to burn trash and bodies. They would be tossed over the side of the cliff, in my understanding. Yeah, that's certainly some people's belief, but there seems to be some contest now in the literature. Sodom and Gomorrah is still in shame. There's still brimstone there. I think that's about the covenant people as a corporate body, hence cutting off parts. Yeah, the cutting off of parts. Yeah, a kind of dualistic meaning as well. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's good for us to get into the fullness of what these meanings might be and to feel comfortable, again, with the imprecision, because imprecision allows us to make mistakes and be comfortable to explore in a way that's authentic and not uh, controlled by fear and accusations of blasphemy and heresy that seek to quiet you for speaking against a sacred doctrine, right? Instead, we can actually explore truth with some freedom. So, there's Grady. Good to see you, buddy. Good to see you. Just as we're about to jump into Tartarus. There's a Greek concept, a deep abyss in Hades reserved for the wicked, particularly the Titans. It's first used in the Bible in 2 Peter 2:4, and it's rendered as hell in the King James Version, but the precise term Peter employs is Tartarus. We read, for if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, Tartarus, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. It's very interesting then. So is Peter conflating the idea of a titan with an angel? That's interesting. What's going on there? So this is the only biblical use of Tartarus, and it's a rare case of full Greek mythos being imported to describe angelic judgment and not human punishment. So it starts to furnish a bit more, I don't know, it's a bit more elaborate now in what it's bringing in as we read through the New Testament. Suddenly we're talking about Tartarus, we're borrowing from this Greek mythos, and we have our own individual judgment for angels, which is very interesting. Very interesting indeed. So we have intertestamental evolution of the concepts. So in First Enoch, in Second Edra, and there's a weird pronunciation of Edras. It's not quite Edras, is it? So in First Enoch, Second Edra, in the Book of Wisdom, and in Jubilees, we see the beginning of layers being introduced to the afterlife, paradise, torment, angelic watchers, cosmic fire. In 1 Enoch 22:10, we read, "Then said I, Woe is me! What sin have I committed that I am seeing the righteous bound?" So this shows the dead awaiting judgment, some in torment, some in peace. So it's interesting. These apocryphal works fill in the blanks. They stitch together Jewish, Greek, and Persian ideas. By the time of Jesus, hell as we know it was already under construction. Okay? So Jesus finds himself coming of age in a society where there's Persian, Jewish, and Greek concepts of hell being stuck together like someone using Lego. And what's the other one? There was another brand of Lego, Connect or something. And they're building just a Frankenstein picture, which is fine. Jesus can step into that culture and gracefully and elegantly communicate a point alluding to some of these concepts. And again, he can do that with a certain grace and elegance of spirit that doesn't necessarily need to be an advocacy for the legitimacy of any one of these particular views. All he wants to do as Christ is communicate something of import that he believes his spirit has been led to do by its relationship with God. And he can speak in the language of the time and the place to do that. And then it's up to us to come with open hearts, open ears, open minds, open eyes, and discern from what's being said the intention of the statement. And if we're so inclined, to consider potential secondary implications. As long as we're getting the main message, I think we're doing the job right of listening. But if we want to speculate as to what might be the implications of a certain statement in terms of adding legitimacy to certain notions and ideas, then that is sometimes a cool little side thing to do, right? we can all do that. That's pretty awesome, you know? So yeah, we're seeing this morality lens entering the picture at this point anyway. Yeah, the King James translators were kind of obsessed with hell. They completely flattened all the nuance out of all the different concepts that are being employed and instead just go for a single uniform term, hell. And in so doing, completely changed the whole dynamic and theological significance of what's being said. So, to summarize this second hour, which I don't think we're abiding by the time, but we might be. Ancient Hebrew thought was non-dualistic. So the good and the bad go to Sheol in ancient Hebrew times. Under Persian and Greek influence, morality became central. So the good are rewarded and the bad are punished. It's a very intuitive sense, and it kind of touches back on the Egyptian way of looking at things in the Zoroastrian. I can't quite get it. Zoe astronaut. The Z astronauts and the Egyptians had something of a duality that was mediated by morality. And then in Greek philosophy, we have the introduction of eternal soul, of dualism, and of punitive afterlife. So, Sheol comes from the Hebrew Bible. It's a place of the dead. It's not a moral landscape. And I don't think it's eternal either. And then we have Hades, which comes from the Greek mythology. It's a shadowy underworld, and it's morally mixed. Is it moral? Yeah, sometimes. And is it eternal? Sometimes. Then you've got Gehenna, which is a Hebrew sort of Jesus era concept. We're talking about the valley of destruction and judgment. And it's a moral place, yes. And is it eternal? Well, that's debated, but we know it as the Valley of Hinnom. And then you've got Tartarus, which comes from Greek mythology, and it's an abyss for rebellious beings, and it is a moral landscape. It's where the bad people go. And yes, it could be seen as an eternal place in the Greek mythos, but of course, borrowed into Christianity, people might paint the picture of these aliens, these angels being thrown into a lake of fire, and we might wonder what that's all about. So the questions become, why do you think the image of hell became darker over time? Is Jesus speaking literally or metaphorically when he mentions Gehenna? And could Greek philosophy have reshaped Christian theology in ways that perhaps we don't quite give it credit? Um, so it's interesting then that the idea of eternal hell wasn't Hebrew, that was a Hellenistic borrowing, that Sheol becomes Hades and Gehenna becomes an important metaphor for judgment. And then we have these pop culture depictions of hell that we owe more to Plato than to Moses. So we see this Hellenistic Platonic influence starting to shape how we look at these things, and I find that quite interesting. I find it quite interesting. Um, yep. So Mailbox says they used fear to compel people into religion, scare tactics. Yeah, it would certainly seem that way, Mailbox. I think what was understood very early on in appeals to masses is the control that fear can have over people. And of course, the control, so you can negatively influence someone by making them fear, or you can positively influence someone by appealing to their appetites. Then, of course, you get moral philosophers, don't you, who talk about different strata of enlightened pleasures, the higher pleasures, right? Who spoke about the higher pleasures? Is that Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mills? And how the higher pleasures take on a much more enlightened sort of. Oh my goodness, my leg is completely falling asleep. I'm gonna have to do some crunches. Oh my god, gotta work that deep thigh, deep thigh muscle. So I don't know. I think that ultimately I've lost my place because I was distracted by my thigh muscle and the fact that I'm not wearing any pants and I just stood up. Hopefully, hopefully that worked out okay. Hopefully the camera didn't catch nothing. What was I saying? Scare tactics. Yeah. So I think people can appeal to the sensorial delights. You might have seen in advertising. Actually, I see this sometimes as a wee meme. Somebody was had completed a work of art, and so they held up the pic. Well, they sent a picture just online of just the art, like that black canvas behind me. Just put a picture on there, and then they had another one where a girl was holding the picture with a low cut top, and the picture of the painting held by the girl with the low cut top had like 10,000 likes, and then the picture of just the painting on a wall had something like a tenth of the attention. So there's something about advertising, there's something about appealing to people, and there's ways to gamify that, right? So there's a reason I'm sat here about to tick off my number. Taking enough. But what this tells us is that the analysis that Mailbox has just shared with us about how fear is used as a scare tactic, that we have been hacked, is true. The church hacked the human mind with something so simple and so effective as fear. And I'll tell you something, when you undo that psychological tension that the church has been winding into your soul for decades now, the healing that you feel is incredibly cathartic. And I don't think it happens overnight. I think it's something where you need to minister to your spirit over the course of weeks and months and gently permit yourself to believe that God doesn't have a place in hell for you. This hell that you've imagined, this hell that you can only imagine. In fact, isn't it more effective as a writer if I do not furnish the villain and instead leave some blanks? Because I know, as an author, that your imagination will do a better job of constructing a fear more potent than anything I could ever write. So I can take you to the point of suggestibility, make your anxiety rise, and then just leave your imagination to wonder at the torture that might befall you should you piss me off. And that right there doesn't sound like the Spirit of God, does it? And yet that would seem to be the scheme that's employed by the church for too long, way too long. Just crazy, crazy stuff happening inside the church. Even in the modern day, that whole Catholic priest fiasco, crazy stuff going on inside the church. The church is an institution, the church is a lumbering bureaucracy, is an utter failure. And human bureaucracies always will fail at the human level. But yeah, total disgrace. Grady says, I do believe, though, that Gehenna, Sheol, Lake of Fire, and Tartarus weren't all the same. Do you? Yeah, they weren't all the same, were they? There was definitely distinction between them. There was a subtle nuance being employed, and I do wonder about the application of that nuance. Was it for particular audiences? Was it to try to legitimize perspectives by using language that would resonate more with some than others, which is the exact same point I just made a second ago, and then I've just repeated myself. Tartarus is a villain on Halo. I love that. I love the Halo references. How about the expression trials by fire? Yeah, trials by fire. Now, there's an utterance that's worked its way into the modern culture. A trial by fire. And people will sometimes wear that as a badge of honor, won't they? Crap, I thought Tartarus was a fish sauce. That's why I haven't been putting Tartarus on my fish. You know what I mean? I don't want angel juice. I don't want damned angels on my cod and haddock. He says universal reconciliation was actually widely accepted till Constantine needed money. More to it than that, but in a nutshell, it holds up. Yeah, there certainly seemed to be a lot of speculation among the early church fathers about the nature of reconciliation and the scope of reconciliation. And it would seem to me that universalism was very much a popular belief of the early church. And like you say, Grady, once those people came along wanting to self-enrich and to legitimize themselves and put themselves at the helm of orthodoxy, that's when things went a bit crazy. We didn't see Willie. Okay, that's good. That's good. We don't need free Willie here. Sorry, guys, get on a funny mood tonight. I am more than welcome. That's it. Love drives out fear. Yeah, that is love. Laughter is wonderful for us, especially these days. Origen was a universalist. Yeah, Origen, great guy. Augustine was a menace. I thought Augustine was this beautifully insightful guy, but Augustine was actually a menace. So let's move into the third hour, right? I might be rattling through this too quickly, but I'll get to a point where people can jump on to. So, hour 3, from Christ to Dante, hell becomes a place, right? So let's work ourselves through this. Work ourselves through it. So hell wasn't always a place. It was a symbol, a metaphor, a warning. But somewhere along the road, between Jesus' parables and Dante's poetry, we built a city beneath the earth. This hour, we ask, who paved the streets of hell? And did they mean for us to take the detour so literally? I'll tell you something, it wasn't the British government that paved the way to hell. They can't he fill a pothole, eh? Come on, come on. Probably Chinese, right? Chinese are brilliant at building roads. So, honestly, I want to blame the Chinese for the concept of hell. We're reaching out internationally. And I'm only joking. I've got nothing against the Chinese except the communism and social credits and all the rest of it. But Jackie Chan's great. Jackie Chan's brilliant. Nah, who knows? Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? Chinese state, if you're listening. If you want to shill for me, send me some money, Chinese state. I'll be up here with a red flag. Nah. So interesting, right? Jesus and his language of judgment would employ Gehenna, right? Still a primary term used by Christ. And parables like the rich man and Lazarus feature fire and torment imagery, but it's debated whether these are rhetorical or literal. So again, it is better to enter into life halt or maimed rather than having two hands to go into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched. Mark 9:43. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth when ye shall see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and you yourselves thrust out. Luke 13:28. So that's an interesting one by Luke 13:28. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth when ye shall see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and you yourselves thrust out. So that's a very interesting statement made by Christ, because he's appealing to the familiarity and the pedigree with which these people see themselves connected. I am a son of Abraham. I am a son of Isaac. I am a son of Jacob. And Christ is saying, well, listen, you're going to be in a pretty sorry state when you see these three and you are not there with them. So what does that mean? Well, again, it's about relationship. It sounds like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are more aligned with Christ, who is more aligned with God, and perhaps represent that covenantal connection, that reconciliation relationship. And those people who would not be attached to that, these Jewish people that he's speaking to, these Israelites that he's speaking to, that they would miss out because they would deny the Christ, and in so doing, lead themselves to destruction at the terminus of the old covenant. They would meet that fire of Gehenna and impact the finality of that last stop on the train, which is AD 70. And it would crash into the walls of the temple, and it would be chaotic for them. And in that, they would just experience that disconnect, that their beloved city and temple have fallen to the Roman armies. It would be clear then that indeed judgment has come. Wouldn't it? I think that would become clear. But history shows us that it wasn't actually that clear. Think about it. What better way to have a secure income than to pay us or go to hell? Oh, and pay extra, and we'll get grandma out too. Yeah, that seems to be a big part of the scheme. Something interesting to think about. Body and soul would be destroyed in the valley outside Jerusalem, according to Yeshua. Yeah, that's an interesting one to think about, Grady. That statement, body and soul. And that statement again, like, fear him who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna. Is that the term? Yeah. It's an interesting one, right? Jackie says, I see the valley of the shadow of death happening nowadays. We can walk down the street and see some people, some are dead, some are alive. Valley of decision. Yeah. I like these terms, the valley of decision. Oof, right? That's a good one. The valley of decision. I feel like if I was in a mega church, I would do a whole sermon about the valley of decision. I'd just be talking to congregations of tens of thousands, The decision, ladies and gentlemen, is should I get a Gulfstream 8 jet plane? And the answer is yes. And only you can make it happen for me. So don't you mess this up for me. You better send me $1,000 each. Yeah, I don't know how these. Was that guy Kenneth Copeland? Joel Olstein? At least Joel Olstein is a bit more slick. Kenneth Copeland, I do not understand. Do you see Kenneth Copeland? Didn't he do a didn't he cut his hand open in one of his sermons? I don't think he literally did, but just a pure performative BS of slitting the palm of his hand open and bleeding into a cup and then giving it to his friend to drink or whatever it was they did. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. At what point did we depart so terribly from Christianity? Um, so Jesus spoke in images, not blueprints. And I think that's an important point to make. And I think that's the point we're talking about when it comes to being comfortable with imprecision, with taking the primary point, but then being open to address secondary implications. But to say that Jesus spoke in imagery, not in blueprints, is a powerful statement. So his hell is wrapped in a parable, or just in parable in general, right? And he was describing spiritual truths or warning of the Roman siege that would leave Jerusalem in flames. I think that's something I would put my name to. Yeah. And then we come to the question of Paul, right? Now, there's people who will comment on my channel that Paul was something of a false prophet, that Paul was perhaps not as qualified as he should be because he didn't meet the strict criteria. Some would say that the idea that Jesus would blind Paul doesn't really compute with the practices of Christ, because Christ wouldn't blind someone, and other such thoughts too. I've never really given much thought to those things. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing in the words of Paul that I find particularly disturbing. There's nothing that Paul writes that I would consider to be deeply contradictory with regards to the message that Christ preached. If you think there are some details there, then you can share them with me at any point. Doesn't matter when you see this video, but I don't really have an issue with Paul, and it's like I don't want to either. That's my bias. If I can put my bias up front, I don't want to have an issue with Paul. I feel like it's perfectly fine. So it's even more work. I'm open to being persuaded, but it's more work for you considering my bias is to sit comfortable with Paul, right? So that's just me being upfront. Doesn't mean I can't change my mind. It just means that's what I'm, I mean, got enough going on, right? Got enough going on. So where is hell in Paul's writing, right? So Paul, writing earlier than the Gospels, never mentions hell. So it's an interesting one. He wrote earlier than the Gospels. Like in my head, that translates as Paul started his ministry before Christ was even anointed. Paul was already doing his thing and advancing the kingdom before Jesus ever took to ministry. That guy got a head start. No, it doesn't mean that. It just means like the writing and the recording of the Gospels, right? So, yeah, Paul's doing his thing, but he focuses on death as a consequence of sin, Romans 6:23. He focuses on resurrection as hope, and Paul focuses on judgment, but without fire and torment language. So isn't that interesting? And it's interesting that Paul does not harp on about hell. He talks about death as a consequence of sin. He talks about resurrection as hope. And he talks about judgment without fire or torment language. I find that quite interesting. And I think the silence, it speaks loudly. Okay? If hell was central to Paul's gospel, Why didn't he mention it? Perhaps it hadn't yet become central to the theology, but was added later. Now, that idea would resonate with what Grady was sharing about how hell became a lasso, right? You know that lasso, and you tie it round the neck of the heifer, and you're like, come on now, right? They're trying to bring it back into the herd because you don't want any wayward Christians. How best to stop them going wayward? Give them something to fear. Tell them where the boundaries are. And tell them that if they step outside of the Overton window of what is acceptable to say, that they will end up in flame. But Paul doesn't do that. Paul doesn't have to do that. Paul just says, look, just send this person over to Satan that they might be sifted, that they might be brought to humility for the saving of the soul. Now, that's very interesting that you would hand someone to Satan, that the soul might be saved at the expense of the flesh. But it speaks to a different dynamic than the one that the priests in later centuries would espouse. It suggests to me there's a certain nuance, there's a certain flexibility, there's a certain cool to what Paul's talking about that these fire and brimstone priests don't seem to have the same connection with. There's a definite difference going on there. Or is there? You might think otherwise. Um, yeah. Just a thought, what if we're talking about something that only had relevance to those who had been in covenant with Yahweh and were going to be destroyed and not anyone else? Just a thought. Yeah, one cannot separate what's being discussed in the New Testament from the context of covenantal relationship. I think that should be a primary lens that's used in our analysis of the terms. It's not to say that, again, talking about the secondary and primary implications of things said in the Bible. It's not to say you can't muse on the secondary implications, but I think there's a primary thrust that seeks to delineate old and the coming new age, the New Testament, the New Testament age. What am I talking about? The New Covenant age, right? So, Paul attacks come from modern Islam and Judaism. Yeah, modern Islam. Um, there's a lot to be said about Islam, especially as it expresses itself in the United Kingdom. 6% of the population, 70% of MI5 terrorists watch list things. It's like, I don't know, there's a lot going on there. Like 40 to 50,000 people being monitored right now out of Islam. There's an issue with Islamic extremism. I think I can legally say that. I've got to be very careful in the United Kingdom. You can be arrested for criticizing Islamic extremism if you don't do it carefully. And I would just like to see more moderate Islamic people condemning terrorism with the same love of country that the English and the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish have for country. Like, I think if you go to a country, you should want that country to thrive and want it to retain what makes it special. I don't think you should move to a country and try to change it culturally forever. And I think it's the government's fault. I don't blame Islam. I blame the government for permitting that to happen. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can look at with demographics. And I don't want to be mean spirited at all. I've got a lot of love for lots of different expressions of Islam. The Sufis, the Alawites. I forget which of the Sunni and Shias I prefer, but it's the same difference as Protestantism and Catholicism, which is very interesting. It's all about how it's structured at the top, right? Um, but that's more on me thing. Um, let's see. I think we try to all place ourselves now in the shoes of the Jews in the first century. I think we eisegesis ourselves somewhere we have never been. Yep. Also, they are stuck in a time loop, Grady. Yep. Gentiles were going to be judged according to their works. 40 years of Groundhog's Day for 2,000 years now. Yep. Trials by fire for saving of the soul. Absolutely, Jackie. Maybe the soul needs the spirit to be eternal. Yeah, there's a whole thing there where you can look at body, soul, spirit. Some people would say, well, a soul is a body with the spirit in it, and all these different configurations of what those things mean. But who knows? Satan in that verse was the priesthood. Hopefully, they would repent in their care. Yeah, mailbox. There is that, isn't there? There's that interesting because Christ probably had to be um, very Aesopian with how he expressed himself so as not to be publicly executed very early on in his ministry. So, as Christ was condemning the church, if he spoke about the threat of Satan and that symbolically referenced something else, like the priesthood, for example, then Christ can spread his message. And again, it's sort of like in Russia during the advancement of some rather brutal forms of communism, reporters and public commentators would have to resort to what's called Aesopian language, like the Aesop's fables. And they would use language that would reference other things to critique the culture. And this was done to sort of preserve their lives and their livelihoods. And it's a tactic that you have to employ to propagate a message in a culture that's hostile to both you and your message. So, yeah, that's something that we have to do in the UK now whenever we want to critique terrorism. Hey, it's great. Um, so, um, yep. Boulos is Paul in Islam. He was a good prophet in their books, but their imams don't teach it. There's an emphasis on different things depending on worldview, isn't there? Really, the soul needs to be aware of the spirit. There's a hadith that says he strengthened the other apostles, but the hadith explains the verse in the Quran. Yeah, it'd be interesting to delve into that a wee bit more. Again, as I say, I'm actually quite worldly. I really love difference. I love people who come from different cultures. Like I genuinely love people, but I just cannot help but note certain cultures might propagate certain problems. And I think a good way to remedy those problems is to accurately define what the issue is and then suggest a solution, even a final solution. I'm not joking, but just some kind of solution. Doesn't have to be the final solution, just a solution, guys. Look, I'm not saying it. Like, all I'm saying is a robust solution would be great. That's all I'm saying. Um, no, I don't think there are massive problems in society right now, but there are problems that need to be addressed, like the grooming gangs. The solution there would be to deport the people who raped those girls in England. Just deport them and deport everyone who hid the crime and charge the police who were obviously in on it, and just make society feel like it can exist without this fear, without this nonsense. I don't know, guys. I could give a robust critique on that, but I'm not in the right mind space for it just now. So the philosophical dilemma: is infinite punishment just for finite crimes? This question, this is a question that many theologians will try to getting the reeds of, right? Is infinite punishment just for finite crimes? Is it just for finite crimes? You know what I'm saying? Is it right? If God is good, can he damn someone forever? If sin is temporal, why is the punishment eternal? Rather disappointingly, I heard Timothy Keller justify this belief. Timothy Keller was a beautiful preacher. Timothy Keller was a lovely man. We won't agree on our theology. I don't think Timothy Keller was definitely not a preterist. He probably would have seen me as a heretic, but Timothy Keller was a lovely gentleman um, who left us a couple of years ago, I think. But his ministry's still maintained by his family. I think he's out of New York or something like that. He's definitely on the East Coast. I think Timothy Keller in America. I just can't get over just how beautiful that man's sermons were. He's really worth a listen. I might be overhyping it, right? But he said that when you sin against God, you sin against an infinite being. When you sin against God, you sin against an infinite being. Therefore, you have sinned indefinitely. You have sinned in perpetuity. Almost as if to say, you have offended a creature, not a creature, because God doesn't belong to the category of created beings, but you have offended an entity which can be pissed off forever. And as a result of that, you're going to hell forever. And I think to myself, well, wait a minute. Isn't this entity that we've pissed off also by very nature, love? Isn't this entity that I've pissed off also the most forgiving entity to have ever existed? And secondly, I would question the fact that I could piss off God, right? That cannot be how we're conceiving of sin. It can't be about, because ultimately, I know that language might sound terse, but that's how we think. That's what we think's happening. Pardon me. We think we're pissing God off. But let me tell you something. If a baby crawled into this room right now and knocked over one of my lights, would I send that baby to hell forever? No. Why not? Because a baby can't piss me off. Because I have the emotional maturity not to be pissed off by a baby. Similarly, if I do something sinful, I wouldn't imagine that that pisses God off, because God cannot be pissed off by a human being. That is way too much credit given to a human being to suggest that I could ever piss off God. Well, I'm going to get a reaction. I'm going to get a rise out of God. I'm going to raise God's blood pressure. That cannot happen. God doesn't have blood pressure. God doesn't have the neurochemistry that allows for being pissed off. So whatever I'm doing, it ain't pissing God off. Now, it might be that God has this wonderfully sublime sense of justice, and that what I do could err, could err from the desire of God. But that's the spirit with which God deals with me is not that of a pissed off titan. That's not the imagination to have. It's very, very different. It's more like, what would love do if you did something that wasn't in accordance with it? Well, I don't think it would love less. I don't think it would hate more. I think it would construct something, or produce something, or permit something of my behavior to manifest I don't know, the challenges necessary to refine me. If that ends up looking like some kind of hellacious environment, so be it. It might be that people do go to something like hell, but it's not what you think, right? It might be that if someone shoots up a school and then puts a 9mm in their brain, that they end up in hell, right? But it's not Hades, it's not Sheol, it's not Dante's Inferno. It's that outer darkness and perhaps a place of wandering, restless dead. And there might be an ecology there that's menacing and dark and brooding and shadow like. Something that comes out of those ancient cultures when they try to imagine the afterlife, that dreariness and dreadfulness, that grayscale place that lacks light and luster. That might be touching on something that's deep in our psyche. And so, such a person who commits a terrible act and then dies might find themselves in that kind of ecology, that kind of environment, because it's where they assume they're going to go. They go to the gutter of the universe, and there's other people in that gutter. And perhaps there's some kind of interaction between them, which might look like torment. But I do not believe that is an impermanent and immutable position, because you wouldn't have experience if it was a spiritual dead end, because ultimately God creates out of himself, and God isn't going to put himself through that. I don't believe that would be a waste of God material. Instead, those sentient creatures would, I believe, through the dread that they experience, begin to feel inspired to make different choices, to resign themselves to the fact that they have misbehaved on a cosmic scale, and that they require some kind of fix, and that there is indeed one who can fix even the most broken soul, and that's God. I mean, in America recently, there's a big story going around, and I hate how this happens in America. I hate how Americans make everything a racial issue. It pisses me off. But everything's a big racist issue in America. I don't believe it is, but people make it a racial issue. So a black kid stabbed a white kid in the chest in school. And if you ask me, the black kid is a piece of trash, right? And it's not because he's black, it's because he stuck a knife into a boy's heart. Why did he have a knife at school? And apparently he's got a rap sheet where he's given a 2-year-old child a brain hemorrhage. It's like, clearly this guy's a piece of shit. And it's like, don't make this a racist issue. Don't do that. Black people can be awesome. They can be presidents. They can be amazing, lovely mentors. And they can be deplorable, horrible murderers. And I'm not saying that this kid's a deplorable, horrible murderer, but he certainly is a murderer. Now, I think that someone like that is missing the qualities of the spirit, you know? From the details of the case that I've gotten, this kid who stabbed was in the wrong place. He incited a reaction, push me and see what happens, and then he murdered. And it seems like, you know, it seems to me that this is someone who's out there looking for trouble. And I would say, well, is that someone who's properly orientated? No, I don't think it is. And and it's just a case of right and wrong at the end of the day. But because it happens in America, and because it happens between a kid who's got dark skin and a kid who's got light skin, it's this massive racial issue right now. And the money as well that this kid's got. I think he's living in a $900,000 a year. No, not dollar a year, but it's a $900,000 house now that he's renting, and he just bought this massive Cadillac and stuff. And it's like, well, that makes me extremely cynical. That makes me extremely cynical with regards to how American society is ordering in itself. I remember when I said at the start of this how if you go into a political discussion long enough and simmer it down, the trace elements that are left are vengeance. Well, that's what I'm seeing. So the father of the child who was killed says, I forgive the person who killed my son, and I don't want this to be a racial issue. And then the people on the other side of it, the murderer's family are like, "Oh hell, this is a racial issue. This is the biggest racial issue ever." And it's like, wait a minute, you don't get to be the victim. You don't get to be the victim here, right? And I just wish I just want the culture to tell these people to go fuck themselves. And it needs to be black people that do it because white people can't do that because it's seen as racist. It needs to be black people. They need to step up and stand against this horrible undercurrent, right? And that's where we as Christians need to step up and challenge our thing. It's so much more potent if it comes from the group. Full preterism doesn't have any venom, if you ask me. If somebody else calls out Christianity and doesn't really care, you've got to be in it to I think move the culture. And so that story just really annoyed me, you know. And I think it's one of these issues where it exposes good and bad and right and wrong and how it can be contaminated by cultural issues too. I don't know exactly how to parse all that. I really don't. But I don't know. I feel like evil's getting away with it. So in America, there are issues that you're not allowed to talk about, like without being accused of things. Like there's a lot of violence in places like Chicago, and it's particularly black gangs doing the violence. But if you try to address the problem, you're called racist. And maybe I've got no right to talk on that, right? Fair enough. Maybe I've got no right to talk about something like that. But here in Scotland, it's Islam. And in the UK, it's Islam. And we had the Manchester Arena attacks with the Abebe family, and all these people were killed, little girls blowing up at a Ariana Grande concert. And you're not allowed to condemn Islam too strongly in this country, or you're Islamophobic. And it's like, well, wait a minute. I think we should be able to call evil evil. I'm not saying Islam's evil, but I think we should be given the confidence to call out the evil elements and even have a little leeway in there if we get a little too fired up and say something about Islam in particular. Obviously, you can't do that with race because race is an immutable characteristic. You can't just say all white people are pieces of crap. Like Muhammad Ali came out and said of human people, I mean, Muhammad Ali is a while ago, right? And he's got every right to condemn the racism that he experienced. But what I thought wasn't good was when he described white people as snakes. And he's like, you can have 10,000 snakes, but if 1,000 of those snakes are lovely and they're married to black people and they give to charity and stuff, hey, they're still snakes. So if 10,000 snakes are coming at me and 1,000 of those snakes are good, hey, how can I trust them, right? They're all snakes. And I thought to myself, dude, don't do that. Do not say that because that can be turned around on you. That can be turned around on the Jews. That can be turned around on Islam. That can be turned around on the Chinese. We cannot talk about each other this way. Instead of black and white, instead of Islamic and Christian and what else, can we please, just call evil evil? Can we do that? And the answer to the question is no, because we are so tribal, because we are so primitive in our thinking. And what does it go down to? Vengeance, right? So there's a lot of people who feel disenfranchised. There's a lot of people who feel pissed off. And that it's all the same spirit. And God is asking us to transcend. I don't think we don't want to become insensitive to worldly problems because there are endemic horrible things that can happen to people for racist reasons and for bigoted reasons against certain religions, for sure. But I would submit that we are becoming far too self critical of well meaningness to the point that the father of the stabbed child who died So the father of the murdered child was kicked out of the press conference where the murderer's family were going to speak. Now he's already said, "I forgive. Let's not make this a big race thing. Let's just be cool." And they kicked him out and called him disrespectful. And it's like, what? Why? Wouldn't you guys want to come together? I don't get it. But what I hate is when people use the underdog position, what might be seen as the underdog position, to advance nonsense. I detest that because it's the ultimate Trojan horse. You know, it's like as a Scotsman, I can get away with a lot saying a lot of shit about the English because the English are seen as the uh, oppressor class. But I'm Scottish and I've been hard done by the Highland clearances and Margaret Thatcher ruined the economy. Like we're like uh, I don't know. We're seen as the underclass and the English are up here. So I can use a Scottish platform to get over on the English, but I don't like that. I don't like that oppression Olympics, you know? So there's something about the morality of that that needs to be adjusted, I think. I don't know how that touches on full preterism. I feel like I just went on a big rant. Just went on a big racist rant. I wasn't racist, right? You guys know that, right? Trust me. No, no, no. But I think society offers these insight into the human soul. And see that tension, it needs to be real. It needs to be real for us to contend with it. It's like the Jews in Jesus' time and the Samaritans and the Romans, and you've got all these groups coming together and they're fighting and there's factions, and it's intense. And we need to deal with that intensity. And what did Christ do with that intensity? Did Christ say, "Oh, it's the Jews that have it right of living down here, or it's the Samaritans that have it right"? Christ didn't do that. He said that spirit and truth would be the way forward. It wouldn't be in this mountain, nor would it be in that temple. It'll be spirit and truth. And that's what I'm trying to push. At the top of the hour, I think it's multiple hours ago, who did I cite as my example of Christ-like behavior? The black jazz musician Daryl Davis, who attended KKK meetings to take the poison out of the hearts of these white supremacists through love. That is the spirit of Christ, and that is a spirit of forgiveness. But that is not the same spirit that I'm seeing play out in American society on the news right now, and the same in the UK. So we need to fix that, right? And we need examples like Daryl Davis. Anyways, no, good to see you, Grady. All the best, mate. Yeah, it's open season on whites. Yeah, it's. I think it's because you're seen as an oppressor class. If you look a certain way, critical race theory or just critical theory in general posits that people of particular immutable characteristics are just oppressors and then others are oppressed. And it's such a manipulative, weird way of looking at the world, man. It's not spiritual at all. It's spiritually dead. So, yeah, where was that? Paul, interestingly enough. So, Paul doesn't use the idea of hell. And we've got this philosophical dilemma. Is infinite punishment just for finite crimes? If God is good, can he damn forever? If sin is temporal, why is the punishment eternal? And you've got Origin, who was mentioned by Grady a wee minute ago, and he says that hell is not eternal punishment, but corrective. So, I have that idea of the refiner's fire. Well, Origin here advances the idea of the refiner's fire, the corrective flame. And it purges, it heals, it refines, and in the end, all will be restored. And there's a name for this. Apo apokata yeah, you heard me say it. I don't have to repeat myself. I'll put it in the chat so people can uh, deal with that a little bit. If somebody wants to throw me the phonetic pronunciation of that, I'll be in your debt. So apokatastasis. apocastasis, guys, that all will be restored. So Origen said in De Principiis, Book 1, so long as the soul has not converted, it must endure punishment until its restoration. So isn't that interesting that Origen says there that where there is a soul that's in a wayward form, then it will endure punishment until restoration. And it's almost like what he's saying, what Origen is conceiving of there is that a soul which is doing evil, let's say, has become misaligned. And what's going to happen to that soul is it's going to come up against bristly, harsh, granulated stuff. And while it traverses that stuff, much like the blade of a knife over some sharpening implement, when the blade of that knife is becomes sharper as a result of the friction between something with a bit of grit, so too does the soul, when encountering the grit of punishment, become streamlined and restored in terms of its sharpness and discerning between good and evil. I think that's what Oregon's getting at, and that makes sense to me. So, Origen was later declared a heretic at the Second Council of Constantinople. Oh my god. Isn't that fun? So there's Origen. Once again, it's the same point I'm making here, where society will try to say we're the good guys and we can only come out with a good perspective. And it will take someone like Origen, who has been trying his best to advance an enlightened position, and it will call him evil. It will say he's a heretic and he deserves to be punished. And Augustine, oh my goodness, Augustine and the eternal flames. So he's a fourth to fifth century theologian, and he cemented the idea of eternal conscious torment. So we didn't have eternal conscious torment as a firm belief until Augustine, this enlightened St. Augustine of Hippo, comes along. And my goodness, this guy was also one of the first to advance punishments for heresy, to physically hurt and kill people for being heretical. There, thank you so much for that, Augustine. So lovely of you. Augustine in City of God, Book 21 says, "They shall be tormented forever. It is a fire which cannot be quenched, and a worm that dieth not." Augustine there wielding that with all the grace and elegance of a toddler with a bucket of paint at their grandmother's house. And the grandmother's like, please don't spill that bucket of paint everywhere. There's no way that 2-year-old's going to listen. So Augustine weaponized Greek metaphysics for Christian dogma by making sin metaphysical, offering God's essence, or rather, by making sin metaphysical, offending God's essence, he justified hell's permanence. It's kind of like what Timothy Keller was saying, right? If you offend God's essence, which is this eternal quality to it, then you have committed an eternal sin, which requires an eternal punishment. As if that makes sense. As if you can quantify something like that, which is so qualitatively disgusting. Apocatatesis. 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 Yeah, I like that. So there's a shift. There's a shift from judgment to architecture, right? There's a shift from an image and an idea to a place. So with Jesus, you have the view of hell that is Gehenna, literally the valley of Hinnom. And this is symbolic and prophetic. Is it eternal? That's debated. And the type of punishment there is fire and exclusion. You then have Paul, And for Paul, the view of hell, there is no hell mentioned with Paul. Is it eternal? Not applicable. The punishment type, he talks of death and separation. Origen, his view of hell, purgative fire, refinement. Is it eternal? No. What's the type? It's corrective suffering. And then you have Augustine. And Augustine's view of hell is a literal eternal torment. And it's, yes, it is eternal in his view. And the punishment type is conscious suffering. So Augustine is a monster in his imagination, right? Nobody asked Augustine to do this. He put forward something that made the world a worse place, if you ask me. So, philosophical dilemma. What's worse, annihilation or eternal pain? Well, annihilation offers justice by ending existence. Torment offers ongoing consciousness, but the cost of that is obviously great. So which is more cruel and which is more merciful? Is it more loving to kill the soul or to keep it alive and screaming forever? Certainly the more merciful point. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows this. It would be more merciful to kill. And so if God was a merciful God, wouldn't he rather destroy than perpetually torment? However, I would submit that God would actually redeem and reconcile moreover than he would annihilate or torment. So we jump now to Dante Alighieri. Let's see what Dante has to say in his Divine Comedy, written in the year 1320. That was 6 years after the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce fought against the English. So, in his, this is Divine Comedy? Yeah, the Divine Comedy, we have Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. It's an afterlife epic. I like the game Dante's Inferno. I quite like the gameplay, and I liked how you could forgive souls or condemn souls, and that would change your powers as you go through the game. It was actually a really, really good game. It's a shame they never made a sequel to that. So the Inferno maps out 9 circles of hell, each with poetic justice. So lust is blown in eternal winds. Gluttons wallow in filth. Betrayers are frozen near Satan. And the philosophical significance of this is that Dante transforms hell into cosmic morality theatre. Each punishment mirrors the sin eternally. And it introduces the concept of personal hells based on vice. Now, if you're familiar with modern depictions of hell, the television show Lucifer uses the personal hell theory, right? Based on your own vice. And I think you see that in quite a lot of modern depictions of hell where it's personalized to the person. I've heard that quite a few times, actually. In the Inferno and in Canto 3, we have abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And this is really what's colouring a lot of our modern consensus on hell, I think, is Dante's Inferno, as well as John Milton's Paradise Lost. Dante's hell is psychological. It's about how sin shapes the soul and locks it into its own prison. He didn't invent hell, but he gave it furniture, districts, and zip codes. And I think that very, very much, when you think about hell today, you're definitely drawing upon Dante's Inferno, because that's influenced a lot of our cultural depictions today. And then you've got Satan's revision in John Milton's Paradise Lost, written in 1667, around about the same time as the Conventicle Act, where you were not allowed to worship God in a church outside of the national church in England. You'd be thrown in prison. Indeed, I think you could be killed if you tried to meet with people to conduct an unsanctioned church service. What a world! Nobody would try to have an unsanctioned church service today in this country, and yet it was illegal, punishable by death under the Conventicle Act of the 1600s. Well, that's what's happening. John Milton writes Paradise Lost. Satan is seen as an eloquent and tragic and defiant entity. There's a line, the famous line from Paradise Lost. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. And this turns hell into a dominion. It's its own domain. It's a kingdom. So it's a kingdom of the self, and it serves as a place of rebellion, and they're seen as like a rebel force almost. In Paradise Lost, Book 1, we read, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. That's actually incredibly profound from John Milton. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. I often think that it comes close to something that Christ would try to communicate, or that Paul would try to communicate with people, and that there is a quality of existence within us that we can establish a relationship with God who comes to rest inside our abode as called out ones as the ecclesia, and that we could establish a heavenly peace within us, or a heavenly, I talk about that irreducible core of optimism. Or we could go the other way with it. And you can make a hell out of heaven, and you can make a heaven out of hell. It just depends on your perspective, your experiences, and where you are in your journey, I suppose. So Milton's Satan is a anti-hero, right? He's a proto-anti-hero, and his hell isn't punishment, it's freedom twisted. So this reshapes how people view damnation as a choice, not a sentence. So the idea of like sympathy for the devil, right? And the idea of like, say, for example, Lucifer, as from the comic books and from the TV show. Was it the comic books, or was it an actual? I think it was a novel written by that guy. I forget his name. He's been done for sexual assault now, but written by that guy, Gaiman, Neil Gaiman. So Neil Gaiman wrote Lucifer and the Sandman and all these things, and you also have like musical artists who write about sympathy for the devil, and they make the devil a charming, lovely man. Right? He's always a charming, lovely, charismatic person. Well, that comes from John Milton. And that's why people often say, well, John Milton and Dante's Inferno, these are, their works are just incredible in terms of their contribution to our perspective on hell. So there is also the idea that hell is locked from the inside. This also makes its way into the work of Neil Gaiman, who produced Lucifer. The idea that you can escape hell, but you're the one that has to open the door, and you won't do that until you've done the internal work. And that's something that Oregon would espouse, right? When Oregon talks about the corrective fires of hell, may not be a literal flame, could be a circumstance within which you have to find the internal resource to question your reality, and that you might find a door to walk through and change. But C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce wrote, if hell is chosen, not imposed, does that make God just or simply absent? It's an interesting one, isn't it? If hell is chosen, not imposed, does that make God just or simply absent? What does that mean, right? It's a very interesting quote. So, the theological shift. Jesus says that hell is a judgment motif and Satan's role is minimal. Origen says that hell is corrective and Satan's role is subordinate. Augustine says that hell is legal torment and Satan's role is the king of evil. Dante says hell is moral theatre and Satan's role is trapped in ice. And Milton says that hell is psychological revolt and Satan's role is a heroic rebel and a tragic villain. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? Did Dante do more to define hell than any other theologian? Is Milton's Satan evil or a mirror of our modern obsession with freedom? And do we believe in hell or in stories about hell? It's an interesting one. And there's something to be said about that obsession with freedom. Some people think that liberalism can go too far in its liberation because if you make all things free and permissible, all you do is legislate chaos. And that's the one thing that liberalism needs to try its best to wrestle with is boundaries. And there's certainly a lot to be said about that. So the takeaway here is that the Christian hell became eternal and literal under Augustine. Thank you, Augustine, for the mental torment. It's not just Augustine's fault, right? If we were in Augustine's place, we might have done the same thing, but it's certainly not great. Dante and Milton made it personal and popular, okay? And philosophers and theologians increasingly struggled with how to justify eternal torment under a loving God. So I think Augustine certainly presented a picture that it gave people pause for thought. It's a shame that Augustine would, from a position of authority and orthodoxy, seek to install something so demented into the software of the church. But the hardware of the church, the buildings, the institutions, now that they're falling apart, particularly in Europe, challenging that software is a lot easier. And I feel sorry for Americans. I don't feel sorry that the hardware is still quite strong in America. I like that. But I think you've got a tougher job in America trying to uninstall that software, which is just, it's so densely written into the code of the church in the USA that you're going to have a hard time. But I think the hard time's part of the journey. Just like Oregon, right? Oregon had this beautiful refiner's fire idea, and they called him a heretic at the second gathering in Constantinople. So, yeah, sorry to hear that. Joe says, I'm still listening, trying to keep up with the Twitter preterists talking about David Chilton. Yeah, they like a wee bit of the old David Chilters. Let's see where am I going now? Oh, I'm on the 4th hour. I'm actually doing a lot better. This is taking me less time. So, popular culture and philosophical hellscapes. That brings us to the 4th hour of tonight's topic. So, popular culture and its hellscapes. Sadism, satire, and the death of divine justice. So, once a symbol of divine justice, hell today is a horror franchise, a punchline, or a psychological condition. It's no longer just beneath us, it's inside us, on screen, and in our metaphors. But behind the screams and sulphur, an old question burns. Did we invent a monster too cruel to believe in anymore? It's a good question. Did we invent a monster that is too cruel to believe in? I think the answer to that might be the affirmative. Let's see what we've got going on there. There's Frank in the chat. Who are the elect? It's a good question, Preston. Got to head out now. Ta-ta for now. Yeah, no worries, Jackie. No worry. I'm just going on. I'm going to soldier on with this. I'm going to soldier right in. So, the Enlightenment. Let's bring ourselves right up to the 17th and 18th century, which brings us to reason over revelation. The Enlightenment ousted Romanticism, and it sort of maligned subjectivity, feeling, emotion, flights of fancy and the imagination. The Enlightenment produced empiricism, observation, replicability, scientism. So it was justice based on proportionality, not divine wrath. And I think sometimes the more fundamentalist Christians respond to the overbearing nature of the Enlightenment worldview, and in that advance in eternal conscious torment against it by saying, well, look, you're just too quantitative. If you looked at this qualitatively, you would be able to justify eternal conscious torment. And while I do share a critique of the overreach of the Enlightenment, I think it's wrong for the reaction to be, well, you guys are just too scientific. If you weren't so bound up in the quantitative, and if you were more spiritually deep, you would see that eternal conscious torment makes sense. I don't agree with that assessment at all, but I do share the criticism of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment thinkers would say that eternal punishment is just barbaric and morally incoherent. And I would agree. So David Hume would say that damnation of men, the most of them, for sins committed during a short life is a doctrine so shocking it would cause even the devil to blush. So isn't that interesting? Obviously, David Hume was a very famous atheist here in Scotland during the Enlightenment, seen as a great philosophical thinker. And he certainly would be someone who grew up in a Christian society. And it's his reaction that the doctrine of hell as eternal conscious torment is so morally repugnant that it would cause even the devil to blush. So what Hume is actually saying there is that the doctrine of hell as eternal conscious torment is blasphemy, which is a lot coming from an atheist. Immanuel Kant would say that punishment must serve moral reform, not vengeance. And I think the reason Kant says that is because of his alignment with Christ. And I think here in the chat as well, we've arrived at the idea that indeed punishment must serve moral reform. It cannot just simply be about vengeance, right? There needs to be an aspect of moral reform, particularly at the level of personhood and the individual. I think nationally and covenantally, there might be appropriate prose that you could use that would imply these are the days of vengeance, that all things written shall be fulfilled. But I think when it comes to a personal level, the idea of a single individual contending with the full wrath of God, it serves only insofar as it seeks to straighten out, like kind of straighten up, shock, reform a person. But to actually step into the gladiatorial arena and face off against God as you wield your steel sword and shield, Nana, that's too terrifying. No man can fight God with sword and shield. And yet, that's the picture we present. I don't think God intends to step into the gladiatorial arena and fight his creations. I agree with Kant that punishment must serve moral reform. And then you have Voltaire, another big stinky atheist. And Voltaire said, not that I don't think Immanuel Kant is, but he finds himself in the company of two here. Voltaire says, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Oh, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Yes, I think Voltaire's touching on the fact there that if you can be manipulated into believing something that isn't quite true, if you can be manipulated into believing a falsehood, then you have not been guarded in your discernment against schemes that might seek to harm others, that might seek to harm the listener. And if you are so gullible, then you might not just imbibe bad information, which are the absurdities, but as a consequence of imbibing the absurdities, that which you externalize, that which you perform, the actions that you take will be atrocities because you have imbibed the absurdity. You have stuck a straw in and sucked the nutrients out of the absurdity. You've intoxicated yourself, and so you commit atrocity. And I think people would say that's exactly what happened with Nazi Germany. People would say that the propaganda and the intellectual miscalibrations of the early 19th century, of the Darwinism that kind of veered into sort of eugenics and the sort of idea of the Übermensch, that these ideas would have contaminated the minds of the intelligentsia and also the bourgeois and the proletariat, and it would have just seemed like this cool thing. I don't know if I should be employing those terms, but you know what I mean? Just the people, the hoi polloi, right? The regular folks. Everybody would be thinking about these crazy ideas, and to the degree that people will believe the absurdities, well, atrocity was certainly committed. So hell moved from being a place feared by sinners to a concept questioned by philosophers. And the Enlightenment didn't kill hell, but it did embarrass it. That's a good point. The Enlightenment did not kill hell, but it did embarrass it. And I would wonder, what would Augustine say if he spoke to David Hume? Well, I imagine that Augustine would have David Hume burnt at a stake, but I don't think that makes it right. So, pop culture, the aesthetic of torment. So, Clive Barker wrote Hellraiser in 1986, not in the 1800s. I don't think there would be an audience for it in Victorian times. But Clive Barker's Hellraiser, everyone knows about that who kind of grew up watching horror films. And it was originally a novella, The Hellbound Heart. And he introduces the idea of the Cenobites. And the Cenobites were not demons necessarily, they were explorers of sadomasochistic sensation. So Pinhead with all the pins on him, basically what they were doing was they were of a cult or a religion that enshrined sensation, and the sensation that they prize is pain. So they try to induce as much pain as possible because they think through the pain they achieve some kind of enlightenment. And so you'll see these disgusting creature creations that models and other effects technicians produce to create these horrific effects. It's not recommended for people. A lot of Christians turn their nose up at horror content, but I think we should engage with the culture meaningfully. I think it's always uncool, and you might react to the word uncool, but if you make yourself above the culture, people don't respond to you. Like Christ had to go to the prostitutes and go to the drunkards, and not to be a drunkard and an advocate of prostitution, but just to meet people where they are. I think if you turn your nose up at popular culture, you can just sometimes disintegrate from it when really you should be integrating with it, not celebrating necessarily dark things, but being proficient in the language so that you have some kind of cultural knowledge that you might be effective with your messaging. I think that has its place. Like, I'm very good at speaking to an audience of Christians, but I don't always want to do that. You know, sometimes I want to turn my attention to an audience of ambiguous people or agnostic people, because I want to engage a large audience, you know. But it's tricky. You got to find a balance to do that. Um, Sometimes I resent the fact that I can't be as relaxed as I want to be because I don't want to offend people. But at the same time, those people keep me perhaps more appealing to uh, to a core that I think just I don't know. There's a certain comportment and conduct that I don't want to stray too far from. So I'm happy to listen to that. But anyways, the Cenobites, yes. Hell becomes a perverse pleasure for those who seek forbidden experiences. Pinhead is the titular character. He's not a titular character, but he is one of the main characters in the Hellraiser franchise. He says, demons to some, angels to others, as they try to define themselves. So hell is no longer about punishment, it's about transgression. This isn't divine wrath, it's erotic horror. You've then got Constantine. Constantine was based on Hellblazer. I'm not sure if that was a graphic novel or just a novel, but there was a 2005 film by, I don't know who it was by, but Keanu Reeves was in it. There was also a television show which was closer to the source material. I think Constantine is supposed to be from Liverpool, England, but in the film, obviously Keanu Reeves is not from Liverpool. um, so in the film or in the franchise, Hell is an apocalyptic mirror of Earth. You saw that in my previous video where it just looks like a trashy Earth and it's stuck in eternal war. And demons walk among us. And Constantine is a cynical exorcist and a morally grey saviour. So purgatory is seen as a realm upon earth. God and the devil are distant and uncaring forces, and personal responsibility is basically all we have amid cosmic indifference in those worlds. That catches the current vibe. I think most people live their lives as if God doesn't care, as if there might be some kind of deism to speak of, but certainly not a personable and knowable God. I think most people would say that strikes me as a good read of existence. And I find that unfortunate because I don't believe that's true. I think that's a failing of the church and of the culture to truly bring to mind what it is to have a relationship with God. Um, Constantine says, God is a kid with an ant farm. Now, that is probably right on the pulse of the culture. I think most people would agree with John Constantine, who says that God is a child with an ant farm. Unfortunately, that is the prevailing thought in Europe. I don't think people genuinely think God cares in any kind of meaningful way, which is detrimental because that contaminates your spirit, right? I think that that becomes you. So you become the irreverent, devil may cry, devil may care individual, right? So in the world of Constantine, hell isn't ruled by justice, but by bureaucracy and silence, and that this is a modern hell, cold, impersonable, or impersonal and corporate. Then, of course, you've got Lucifer, the TV series. You've got Lucifer Morningstar, charming, witty, flawed, and deeply introspective. He leaves hell because he's tired of punishing souls. And he introduces the concept that people damn themselves, right? Kind of touches on what Lewis said about hell being locked from the inside. Well, Neil Gaiman picks that up in his creation of Lucifer. So the character says, people come here because they believe they deserve to. and that's what they get. Hell is just their own guilt, right? Very similar to what Neil Gaiman is saying, kind of touching on Oregon's concept of the purgative fire. If you can forgive yourself of that guilt, you unlock the door to hell. You have been refined and you can walk through it. So, yeah, that comes from Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics. And it resonates also with Sartre, Sartre, you know that guy, Jean-Jacques Sartre or Claude Sartre, or whatever his name is. Hell is other people. So Lucifer takes a radical stance. Hell is psychological. Guilt is the flame, and the doors are unlocked from the inside. So then you have a TV show like The Good Place, which is on Netflix. It's an NBC comedy with Ted Danson, and it's a satirical take. So hell and heaven is replaced with a point system. Characters discover they're actually in a fake good place that is actually hell, and it's a psychological experiment. And we have a quote that says, "What matters isn't if people are good or bad. What matters is if they're trying to be better today than they were yesterday," which is actually a nice sentiment. There is a kind of cheatiness to The Good Place. I can't watch it all because it's just not on my wavelength, but it's a nice enough wee show. So this hell critiques bureaucratic morality. Even goodness is gamified, but behind the jokes is a real concern. Can anyone ever be good enough? It's a good question. So, what if hell is in us? C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce. The gates of hell are locked from the inside. Hell is self chosen alienation from God. Jean Paul Sartre, in his No Exit, says hell is other people. Right? Hell as impersonal torment. You've got Simon Weil, who says hell is the distance from God. Oh, that's a nice one. I like that one. Hell is the distance from God. Just the way that's structured as a sentence. Hell is the distance from God. Yeah, I like that. So these thinkers propose that hell isn't somewhere we go, it's something we become. It's a state, it's a habit, it's a self inflicted exile. And yeah, I think there is something offered to us then by the popular culture. Um, we can sometimes extract something of an insight, not great, but something. So, yeah, what are we at now? We're talking about annihilationism. Let's just jump into annihilationism. So, in annihilationism, souls are destroyed, not tormented. And this is common among Seventh-day Adventists, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, and some evangelicals, such as Edward Fudge. The wages of sin is death. So you might consider that to be justification for annihilationism. Hell is seen as death and not life in torment. And this aligns better with the moral intuition and biblical language available to us. I think it's a convincing idea, isn't it? Annihilationism. It kind of is a bit more palatable, it's a bit more intuitive. But my bias has me wanting to believe in universalism to BH. Supernatural was crazy. IMO. Oh yeah, Supernatural. I just watched all of that like over the winter. I think I watched 15 years of television in like 4 weeks, and it was a lot. It was a lot to get through, but I felt like I had to watch it all because I kind of liked it. I thought these guys are kind of cool, and I think they're both from Texas, the actors, and they had good chemistry. And I was like, it's a kind of fun show. I like the X Files. This is kind of monster of the week. And then they bring in one of the actors from the X Files, and I thought, that's kind of cool. And you could tell that the people who made it were fans of horror. You know, at one point, Dean introduces himself as like Ashley J. Williams as he's pulled over, and I was like, oh, that's an Evil Dead reference. Yeah, Kripke. Yeah, he's pretty good. And then the boys as well. So, no, it'd be nice to follow that. I quite like those guys now after kind of binge watching them all. That's me a fan now. Um, aye. So, universalism. It's a big one. It's the one I think most people would like to be true because it is the nicest outcome possible, right? Obviously, some people might contend, well, look, universalism, really? What about Adolf Hitler? What about, Mao Zedong? What about nasty people like Genghis Khan? Well, you know what? They're oppressed by nature too, right? They're oppressed by nature too. They could have been different, but the circumstances damned them to their lives that they lived. I mean, if you modified the circumstances of their lives enough, couldn't they have been better people? Is that too reductive to think? I don't know. But universalism is the belief that all will be saved, that hell is corrective and not punishment for the punishment's sake, right? And it's inspired by thinkers like Origen, who really influenced David Bentley Hart. David Bentley Hart has some really good polemics. David Bentley Hart doesn't like it if you advance eternal conscious torment. He calls you out quite strongly for that belief. He just calls you a blasphemer. He just says you're a heretic, that you're someone who's contemptible, and it's a scumbag belief, basically. He's quite harsh in the way he comes out to condemn it. And the justification for universalism is just things like 1 Corinthians 13:8, that love never fails. If love wins, how can hell be forever? It's a good point, to be honest. So, is an all powerful God justified in letting anyone suffer eternally? If God can save all but doesn't, is he all good? If he wants to, but he can't, is he all powerful? Either way, eternal torment seems incompatible with omnibenevolence. So, to summarize the modern literature and media, Hellraiser by Barker is about hell as erotic sadism, and the key theme is transgression. The Sandman by Gaiman, hell is self-inflicted guilt, and the key theme is identity and free will. And Lucifer, another product of Neil Gaiman, hell is voluntary exile, and the key theme is guilt and autonomy. In The Good Place, hell is systemic satire, and the key theme is moral complexity. And then in The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, hell is psychological separation, and the key theme is choice and trajectory. So, quite interesting. We might wonder, do modern versions of hell say more about us than about theology? Do we project a lot of our own stuff onto concepts of hell? Is that useful, or does that detract? Or is it necessary because of the relative silence in the Bible on these topics? Is guilt our new devil? Is alienation our fire? Can a world that rejects authority still believe in hell? Can a world that rejects authority still believe in hell? It's an interesting one, right? Goes back to that idea of hell being used as an authoritative stick to sort of shepherd you into the direction that whoever wields the stick desires you to go. But if you remove that stick and you give yourself the freedom to question certain concepts like hell, salvation, I think that might be seen as rather liberating. I think you can do a lot with that, and I might question the motivations of those with the hell stick. Like, what exactly are they trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? Yeah, mailbox. It is, isn't it? It's just dumb fun. It's just cool fun. Just as preterism gave me more to think about in the larger picture. Yeah, it really does. Gives a lot to think about. So, to wrap up the pop culture segment, hell in the modern era becomes a metaphor for guilt, shame, systems, and choices. It's a canvas for horror, humour, and philosophical reflection. And philosophers of pop culture now question God's justice and even his existence through the lens of hell. And so that brings us to the fifth hour, which is good because I've only been running for 2 hours and 55 minutes. So, hour five is hell around the world and final thoughts. So, it would only be fitting, I believe, to jump into other cultures, right? Because we've been very much invested in Christianity. We've touched on Islam a little bit, but we'll look at that a bit more here as we wonder what do other religions do then, right? Where did other cultures go after the Zoroastrians, after the Mesopotamians, after the Egyptians? It's not like everybody just became a Hebrew, right? The Greeks had their own thing going on. We touched a little bit on that. What else is going on further afield? So this is it. We have to ask ourselves the question. So every culture had its idea of justice, of right and wrong. So is it true to say that every culture saw fire in the dark? And the answer to that's actually no. So let's trek around the globe. Let's find out. Did Christianity invent the most terrifying hell or just the loudest one? Well, Islam has the concept of Jahannam. No, I didn't say that right. Jahannam, right? Jahannam. Interestingly, Jahannam is derived from the word Gehenna. Isn't that interesting? That hell in Islam comes from the word Gehenna, which we know means Valley of Hinnom, except they call it Jahannam. So that's very interesting to me. And it's described in vivid imagery across the Quran. There's 7 levels of punishment for different sins. For example, Hatma, Sakar, there's a Quranic quote here, and fear the fire which has been prepared for the disbelievers. Indeed, Jahannam has been laying in wait for the transgressors, a place of return. So, the key concepts here in Islam is that it's not necessarily eternal for all people. Some Islamic schools, especially the Sufis, believe in eventual reconciliation, tahqiq, which is a divine realization. Souls are judged with mizan, scales of justice, similar to the Egyptian mat. So the souls are judged with scales of justice. Isn't that interesting then? So Islam's hell shares a family resemblance to Christianity because it implies Gehenna, right? Only they furnish Gehenna slightly differently, don't they? You can see where the changes have come in. Some of them don't think it's permanent, and even in that fire, there's the possibility of mercy. Also, that Egyptian concept of the balancing on the scales, which might be just a ubiquitous idea of justice and balance, but interesting, right? Then you've got Hinduism and Buddhism, right? Hinduism and Buddhism, they bring us the Naraka. And in the Naraka, we have temporary hells, tied to karma, not divine judgment. Often described as hot, cold, brutal, or psychological, based on misdeeds. After serving time, the soul is reincarnated. In the Hindu text, the Garuda Purana, chapter 5, we read, those who engage in cruelty. I want to do it in an Indian accent, but I don't know if that's a hate crime. So I want those who engage in cruelty shall fall into the Naraka of Ravara, Rarava, Rorava. Those who engage in cruelty shall fall into the something filled with fire and cries. And then in the Buddhist text, in the Majjhima Nikaya, lovely Buddhist text, I read it all the time. If one kills a living being, one will be reborn in Avicii hell, where the pain is ceaseless. Avicii equals the worst Buddhist hells, but still not eternal. Interesting. Very interesting. So we've got the idea of fire from the Hindu text, and we have the idea of cries of pain and pain being ceaseless in the Buddhist text. But these are not necessarily eternal states. These are for refinement and change. So, yeah, hell is a cosmic jail sentence and not a death penalty. The system is impersonal, karmic, and restorative over time. Very interesting, isn't it? The fact that it's karmic. So it's not like some divine judgment. It's just this system that is just like a corporate structure. And if you don't get the right points or if you do something wrong, just this unstoppable, irrational force just puts you into this experience for a while, and then you come out the other side of it richer from the experience, I'm sure. Let's touch on Judaism just a little bit in this context. So in Judaism, we talked about Sheol and Gehinnom. So that had rabbinic development. So in the Talmud area, Gehinnom is viewed as a purgatory, which is very interesting. Not not eternal damnation, but their Gehenna was purgatory. And souls are purified for 12 months and then move on. Isn't that interesting? 12 months and then they move on. So in the Talmud and Mishnah 2:10, it says, the judgment of the wicked in Gehinnom is 12 months. Well, isn't that wonderful? Doesn't that seem a little bit arbitrary and weird? What do you mean 12 months? What are you talking about? 12 months? And some transcendent, strange, other realm? Time is measured in months. So, all right. 12 months in Gehinnom. And for the truly wicked, some of the rabbis said that you might be destroyed. Not eternal torment, but just destruction. So Judaism, even in its mystical strains, rejects eternal conscious torment. So God's justice includes rehabilitation or release. And then we might turn to the indigenous and animist traditions. And there's some general patterns that emerge from these. Afterlife is often tied to ancestral realms, nature, or the spirit world. No concept of eternal punishment. Wrongdoers may become lost spirits or fail to join the ancestors. So in Japan, in the Shinto, you've got the idea of the Yomi, which is a shadowy land of the dead, and that sounds a lot like Sheol. It's not judgmental, just a shadowy land. In the Maori tradition in New Zealand, spirits journey to Cape Regina. I don't know if that's how you say it. Cape Ringa, to pass into the afterlife. I take it that's just a geographical place in one of the islands of New Zealand. So the spirits journey there and then go into the afterlife. And in the Navajo, uh, they have an avoidance of the dead, a ritualized avoidance, not fearful, not feared due to punishment, but due to imbalance. The Navajo avoidance of the dead is ritualized, not feared due to punishment, but due to imbalance. Interesting. So here we can see that many cultures just did not produce the same results that Christianity and even Judaism in its mystical forms didn't come out with the same hellacious landscape as Christianity. I'd say Christians went even further and more menacing than even the Islamic texts produce, in terms of their concepts of hell. So these cultures here, they never quite got to the same fiery hells. And instead, they imagined reconnection, disharmony, or restoration. So hell, as we think of it, is a cultural anomaly. So there's also the idea of cultural contagion. So why is Christian and Islamic hell so similar? Because if we're going to draw a thread between any tradition, it's interesting that the Hebrew scripture and the Jews are not as similar. The compatibility and belief between Christians and Jews, you may expect a bit more, but when it comes to hell, it's Christianity and Islam that are actually more similar. And that's because of their shared roots. So they both come out of Second Temple Judaism to a certain extent, and they've got influences in Zoroastrianism, dualism, and Greek philosophy, and the apocalyptic literature of First Enoch and Second Esdras. There's the chain reaction. So the Zoroastrians introduced moral afterlife and fire. The Greeks introduced dualism and the immortal soul. The Apocrypha blends judgment and metaphysics. And then Christianity and Islam inherit these and then radicalize them. So what we might call hell is a fusion, Persian fire, Greek philosophy, and apocalyptic dread. It's less divine revelation and more theological collage. So that's interesting to learn. We might debate some of that, but let's just fire on through. So, did hell get worse as religion gained power? That's an interesting question. And we can see that some of the arguments we've made tonight are indeed that the fear that can be visited upon a people through hell has a certain utility in the retention of numbers and the spread of ideas. Fear can be a contagion that can be quite persuasive. It's interesting that the concept of hell in the beginning did seem to have a restorative view. It was shadowy, but it wasn't permanent. And then as religion became more institutionalized, and you have people like Augustine coming into the scene, it's controlled via fear. And there's that coercive aspect of that fear, right? So we wonder, could hell have become a tool of state power and doctrinal enforcement? I think the answer to that is yes. And it's very dark and twisted to imagine the fact that hell became a tool of state power and a tool of doctrinal enforcement. We invented hell to enforce state power and to hold up doctrines. That's crazy. We should have been relying on God, relying on the qualities of the Spirit. Instead, we invented something so anti-God. Very interesting. So let's do a little comparative synopsis here. So Christianity, yep, some people would say its view of hell is eternal. Some would say it's not. Some would say it's for punishment. Some would say it's for refinement. It's based on sin versus holiness. and it's described as fire, darkness, separation. In Islam, it's seen as sometimes eternal. Its purpose is purification and punishment, and it's based on faith and deeds. And description again is flames. They've got levels, redemption for some. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it's not eternal. It's based on actions and karma, and it's a lot of different temporary realms and cyclical rebirth. In Judaism, hell is rarely eternal. Its purpose is purgation. It's based on community ethics. And it's a 12-month purification program. So in Judaism, hell is like a rehab that you go to. You spend your 28 days. And then in animism, no, it's not eternal there. It's based on ancestral balance and harmony with nature. And it's more of a Shadowlands situation or reincarnation. So, closing the loop, the theological and cultural implications of these things. So, hell has evolved. It wasn't revealed. What we understand to be hell was not revealed to us by God. This was 100% constructed over centuries of fantasy, right? And its furnishings as a product of fantasy were given to us by poets and by philosophers and by lots of different empires that held up all these different traditions. And in many culture, punishment was seen as temporary, but eternal conscious torment was always very rare, insofar as conceptualizations as hell go. And it's only since Augustine, which has been quite a while, but before Augustine, we didn't have this. So we might wonder, what kind of afterlife would a just God create? John Locke, David Hume, Voltaire, they all thought that the idea of hell was repugnant. Origen thought much the same. C.S. Lewis, he seemed to come to this idea that hell might be locked from the inside. What would a just God create or facilitate for his creation? Would he torture them forever? The consensus we're coming to is no. Is the idea of eternal hell a cultural artifact or spiritual truth? Well, we've seen the evidence tonight that eternal hell would seem to be a cultural artifact. It's a work of art, and it's quite an abominable piece of art. And it's also seen as a repressive tool, something that's wielded by the state to produce certain behaviors and orthodoxies. Has hell done more harm than good? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. Was the wielding of that fear actually conducive to the organization of society? You know, is that part of what kept people in check? Or was it just this strange spiritual imposition and dread that some people who felt, you know, that could persuade them, they fell folly to it? Most people didn't really think about it. Who knows? I think it's probably done more harm than good. That's just my gut feeling, that perhaps more harm than good has come from that. Although I can't be sure. I can't be sure. And what would happen if we let it go? Well, here in the United Kingdom, many people have let go of faith entirely. So I don't know that it even matters in this country. But I would imagine that if we let go of hell, lots of people in the church would react negatively and think to themselves, well, you're removing a doctrine which has been established, so that's heresy. But I imagine lots of other people would imagine that it's actually quite enlightened to let it go. That David Bentley Hart, he seems to be advancing that position to, quite a lot of success. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about there. And in the end, maybe the most terrifying thing about hell isn't fire or torment. It's the fear that we might have made it all up and never asked who we were punishing or why. That's kind of what I feel about the end times. Maybe the scariest thing to imagine is that the world already ended and that we were too callous to discern the end. That was one of the questions that led me to preterism and full preterism. What if we were too callous to detect the end of the world? So yeah, no, that's brings us to the last slide, I think, right? Final reflections. Hell is more cultural construction than divine decree. It's used to reflect power, fear, and philosophy across time. Is eternal hell a spiritual truth or a moral contradiction? And what happens when we imagine better endings? So that's been 5 hours, guys. I know it feels like it hasn't been 5 hours, but we have experienced something physicists refer to as time dilation. And the reason we've experienced that is because the gravity with which we brought to this discussion kind of warped time. And so between us, as experienced on YouTube, we have effectively traveled through time and space, much like the Event Horizon. Guys, the Event Horizon ship, people say it's a bad thing. I think it's a great project. It's going to help us traverse space. It's going to be great. Um, but we've had an interesting time talking about the pop culture, talking about the historical origins, the evolution of hell, and I think ultimately after that tour, I feel extremely confident to drop the gavel on the judgment that hell is a fiction in its conceptualization, and that where it might have some truth to it as a culture, we haven't really examined the the kind of pure and truthful aspects of what a spiritual refinement might look like. I don't think we've really done that project. I think we've been good at constructing a fantasy of hell, and we have not been good at producing a truthful, accurate representation of purgative refinement and what that might look like. And I'm not sure we can. I'm not sure what that would look like exactly, but boom, we just did it, guys. Yep. Bad eschatology gave us so many bad religions. It's a good point. That bad eschatology gave us bad religions. I don't think Augustine would have enshrined eternal conscious torment if Augustine had been more sensitive to the fact that the new covenant and its implications were all about that victory, were all about that reconciliation that we can have with God. I think he missed so much detail there. And hell has tortured the minds of people for decades. That's the fruit of bad religion. So thank God that we live in this time, that we have the information available to us to comprehend the truth. Not that we might just enjoy it, but that we can also enjoy discussing it and bringing that light to other people. I think that's awesome. Um, it's like what Jesus said, don't hide your light under a bushel. Is that what he said? I don't know if that's what he said. He said something like that. Don't hide your light, your lantern under your bed. You got to hold it up and let people see your light. Be the seasoning, right? So that's what we've done here tonight. We've been seasoning. We just quashed the fires of hell, guys. Hell's done. We just destroyed hell. Should we have done it? I don't know. I don't know if we should have done that. We just opened the gates of hell. No, we didn't. No, what we found out was there's no gates of hell, right? That's what we found out. That's what we found out. And yeah, it was quite a deep and contemplative conversation. And I don't think I derailed it too much, right? I think we stayed on topic enough. So I'm satisfied. That's 3 hours and 19 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and cook myself a courgette with some chicken because I I have a genetic malfunction with my methylation. Something MFTHERTT, some gene expression which means my methylation or processes don't work as well. And I'm sensitive to histamine, so I can't eat fermented foods. I went on a massive fermented food binge. I was eating only fermented foods, and then I was crippling, doubling over in pain. And I've also got um, Gilbert syndrome, which is a liver condition where my liver produces bile, but in a sluggish way. So if I eat foods that are high in fat, it just cripples me again because my liver has to work double time. It's not really, it's a benign condition. None of these things are serious health conditions, but they completely disturb your day and lifestyle because of the discomfort of the symptoms. So I need to moderate them. So if you ever find that you're struggling with your food, it's 1 in 10 people suffer with this sensitivity. It's a food sensitivity. So if you find after eating lots of uh, heavy, rich, fatty foods or sweet things or fermented foods that you're just really gassy and bloated and uncomfortable and sort of anxious, then you might be MF or TT, whatever that is. Little nutritional advice to cap this discussion on hell, guys. Right, calling it a night. Calling it a night. That's 4:20 in the morning here. Thank you for joining me. I believe we have set the world to rights once again. Um, I'll do another one of these maybe at the weekend, which is now, I think it's now the weekend over here. Yeah, it's now Saturday. I'll wait until Saturday night. See you later, guys. God bless. Great topic. Those are the final reflections.